I was straightening the collar of my husband's old Navy suit, the exact suit he wore the day I sold my family inheritance to save him from absolute financial ruin, when a heavy piece of plastic slipped from a hidden tear in the lining. It was a room key for a luxury resort. When I drove to that resort the next morning, the front desk clerk did not just confirm his stay. She smiled warmly, told me my baby was absolutely beautiful, and handed me a complimentary family portrait they had left by the pool. The man in the photo was my husband. The woman holding his child was my younger sister. I am Emily. I am 32 years old, and I work as a loan underwriter for a regional bank in Charlotte, North Carolina. Tonight was supposed to be a milestone, a celebration of survival and loyalty. It was our 5th wedding anniversary. I had left the bank an hour early, navigating the heavy evening traffic on Providence Road, my mind buzzing with plans for a quiet romantic evening at home. I had stopped at the premium grocer to pick up 2 thick ribeye steaks, fresh asparagus, and a bottle of expensive Cabernet we usually only reserved for holidays. I was determined to make our home look perfect before my husband Brad walked through the front door. Brad is 34, a charismatic man who runs his own real estate firm. That is the polished, successful version of the story he tells the congregation at our church. The real story, the one we keep hidden behind closed doors, is much darker, and I am the only reason he is still standing. While the steaks were resting on the granite counter, I decided to go upstairs to our master bedroom to tidy up his closet. I wanted everything to feel orderly and peaceful. As I adjusted the hangers, my eyes fell on it. Shoved all the way to the back of the rack was his old navy blue suit. Seeing that specific piece of clothing always brought up a complicated wave of emotions inside me. It was the exact suit he wore 3 years ago, when he stood before a judge in federal bankruptcy court. I remember that terrible day vividly. I remember the cold, sterile smell of the courthouse hallways, the way his hands shook as he held his briefcase, and the absolute crushing despair in his eyes. He had made a series of reckless business decisions, leveraging assets he did not have, and racking up $150,000 in commercial debt. He was on the verge of total ruin. He was about to lose his business, his professional license, and his reputation. So I did what I believed any devoted, loving wife was supposed to do. I sacrificed my own future to protect his. I sold the 60-acre farm my late grandmother had left to me in her will. It was my only inheritance, my ultimate safety net, and the place where I had spent all my happiest childhood summers. The land meant everything to me, but I sold it to a commercial developer without a second thought, taking the cash to pay off his creditors and wipe his slate completely clean. I saved him from prison and bankruptcy. I spent my entire 20s working grueling overtime hours at the bank. During the day, I calculated debt-to-income ratios, assessed financial risks, and approved loans for other people to buy their dream homes. At night, I came home and pinched every single penny so we could survive, while Brad slowly rebuilt his pride and his real estate business. I wore discount clothes, drove a 10-year-old sedan with a rattling engine, skipped vacations, and packed a cheap lunch every single day. I poured my youth and my energy into the foundation of our marriage. In our tight-knit traditional church community, my parents Thomas and Susan constantly praised me for this. They would stand in the church foyer after Sunday service, beaming with pride, telling the pastor and the other elders how I was the absolute picture of a devoted Christian wife. They held me up as the sturdy glue that kept our marriage together through sickness and in health, for richer or poorer. My parents always valued duty and sacrifice, especially from me, their oldest daughter. They expected me to be the responsible one, the rock of the family. Brad played his part in this narrative flawlessly. Whenever we were at social gatherings, he was the grateful, reborn businessman who publicly credited his success and his salvation to his loyal, hardworking wife. He played the humble, redeemed man so well that I never once questioned his sincerity. Looking at the dusty navy suit in the back of the closet, I decided I would take it to the dry cleaners tomorrow morning. Maybe he could wear it to church this Sunday. It felt highly symbolic of how far we had come from those dark, terrifying days. I grabbed the jacket off the hanger and started checking the pockets for forgotten receipts, loose change, or old business cards. That is a deeply ingrained habit you pick up when you do the household laundry for 5 years. My fingers slipped into the left interior breast pocket, but it was empty. I moved to the right interior pocket. As my hand reached the bottom, I noticed the silky lining was slightly torn near the seam. It was a small, ragged hole, the kind that happens when something sharp catches the fabric over time. I traced the tear with my index finger, pushing slightly deeper into the lining of the jacket. I felt something hard, smooth, and flat, wedged deep inside the fabric, completely hidden from the outside. I pinched the object between my fingers and carefully pulled it up through the hole. It was a thick, glossy plastic card. I turned it over in my hand, walking toward the window to catch the fading evening light. Staring at the elegant gold-embossed lettering on the dark green background, my breath caught in my throat. The text read, "The Magnolia Inn." It was a luxury boutique resort located about 20 miles outside of Charlotte, nestled quietly up near the lake. It was widely known as an exclusive high-end destination. It was the kind of place affluent couples went for romantic weekend getaways, the kind of place famous for its private hot tubs, couples massages, and champagne on ice. It was certainly not a place for cheap business meetings. Brad had not traveled for work in over a year. All of his real estate properties and clients were strictly local. He had absolutely no professional reason to be staying at a luxury romantic resort 20 miles from our home. And he certainly had no reason to hide the room key inside the lining of his old bankruptcy suit. My heart gave a strange, hollow thump against my ribs. The air in the bedroom suddenly felt very thin, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. I stood frozen, staring at the green plastic card, while my mind began racing backward, frantically reviewing the last few months of our life together. I thought about his frequent late nights at the office, the times he came home smelling faintly of expensive soap instead of his usual cologne. I thought about the weekend property showings he claimed he had with demanding out-of-town investors, appointments that took up his entire Saturdays. I thought about the subtle way he guarded his phone, placing it face down on the kitchen counter or taking it with him into the bathroom while he showered. They were all tiny, seemingly insignificant red flags that I had willfully and stubbornly ignored because I loved him and I trusted him completely. I had built my entire existence around the belief that we were a team, that my sacrifices had bought his unwavering loyalty. As I stood there, shivering in the middle of our perfectly decorated master bedroom, my phone buzzed loudly on the wooden nightstand. I jumped, dropping the suit jacket to the floor. My heart hammered wildly against my chest. I walked over and picked up the phone. It was a text message from Brad. I tapped the screen, dreading what I was about to read. The message popped up in a gray bubble. "I am so sorry, honey. I am stuck at the office. This new commercial property deal is taking way longer to close than I expected. The clients are being difficult with the paperwork. I might be stuck here for another few hours. Do not wait up for dinner. Happy anniversary. I love you so much." I stared at the bright screen, reading those last two sentences over and over again. Happy anniversary. I love you so much. The words tasted like ash in my mouth. A naive woman, the trusting wife I had been just an hour ago, might have texted back saying it was perfectly fine, that she understood the demands of his job, and that she would keep his ribeye steak warm in the oven. A hot-tempered, emotional woman might have called him immediately, screaming through the phone, demanding to know exactly what he was doing with a hidden hotel room key from the Magnolia Inn. She might have threatened him, cried, and demanded an immediate confession. But I did neither of those things. I'm a professional loan underwriter. My entire career, my daily livelihood is built on verifying facts, analyzing financial discrepancies, and spotting complex fraud hidden in plain sight. I look at the raw numbers, and I demand undeniable proof. If there is a lie, I know how to find the paper trail. In that moment of shattering betrayal, my underwriter instincts kicked in. A cold, sharp, and highly rational focus washed over me violently, pushing the rising tide of panic and heartbreak deep down into the pit of my stomach. I knew that if I confronted him now over the phone, or when he walked through the door, I would get nothing but a messy argument full of desperate denials and gaslighting. He was a salesman. He made his living convincing people to believe him. He would have the chance to invent a highly plausible excuse. He would look me in the eye and tell me he found the keycard in a rental car, or that a wealthy client had given it to him by mistake after a property viewing. He would turn the situation around, accusing me of being paranoid, of ruining our anniversary with baseless suspicions. I refused to give him that power. I refused to let him manipulate his way out of this. I needed absolute undeniable facts. I needed to know exactly what was happening behind my back before I let him know that the blindfold had been removed. I walked over to the bed, picked up the green plastic keycard, and slid it into the hidden zippered pocket of my leather purse. I walked downstairs to the kitchen. The beautiful thick steaks were still sitting on the butcher block counter. The expensive red wine was breathing in the crystal decanter. The house was perfectly quiet, but the silence was no longer peaceful or comforting. It was suffocating. Every wall I had painted, every piece of furniture I had carefully saved up to buy, suddenly felt like a prop in an elaborate, cruel stage play where I was the only person who did not know the script. I calmly turned off the oven. I packed the raw steaks into a plastic container and shoved them into the back of the refrigerator. I picked up the heavy crystal decanter, walked over to the kitchen sink, and poured the expensive wine straight down the drain, watching the dark red liquid swirl away like blood. I stood at the sink and washed my hands, staring at my reflection in the dark kitchen window. I was not going to cry. I was not going to fall apart. Tomorrow morning, I was going to call in sick to the bank. I was going to drive 20 miles to the Magnolia Inn, and I was going to find out exactly what my husband had been doing and who he had been doing it with. The morning sun filtered through the bedroom blinds, bright and completely oblivious to the fact that my entire life had fractured the night before. I had not slept a single minute. I sat on the edge of our mattress, staring at the green plastic hotel keycard resting on my nightstand. At 7:30 in the morning, I picked up my phone and called my bank branch manager. I kept my voice perfectly level, claiming a sudden severe migraine, and told him I needed to use one of my accrued sick days. It was the first time I had called out of work in 4 years. After hanging up the phone, I went to my closet and dressed with deliberate, calculating care. I chose a tailored gray blazer, a crisp white blouse, and black slacks. I needed to look like a woman who managed money and demanded answers. I needed to look like a professional, not a panicked, heartbroken wife chasing ghosts. The drive from our quiet neighborhood in Charlotte out to the lake resort area took exactly 42 minutes. I drove with the radio turned off. The silence inside my 10-year-old sedan was incredibly heavy. With every mile that ticked by on the odometer, the scenery outside my window shifted dramatically from busy suburban intersections to winding tree-lined roads flanked by large iron gates and sprawling manicured estates. This was serious wealth. This was the kind of money Brad always talked about acquiring one day. As I navigated the curving roads, I rehearsed the lie I was going to tell the hotel staff. As a senior loan underwriter, I knew exactly how financial disputes worked. I knew the specific corporate terminology, the right tone of mild administrative annoyance, and the precise amount of verbal pressure to apply to customer service representatives to get them to pull up confidential billing records without raising any suspicion. I pulled into the sweeping circular driveway of the Magnolia Inn. The place was absolutely breathtaking. Massive stone fountains bubbled softly in the center of the brick courtyard, and valet attendants in sharp-pressed uniforms hurried to open doors for wealthy guests stepping out of luxury imported vehicles. I parked my old rattling sedan in the self-parking lot far away from the grand entrance. I gripped the strap of my purse, squared my shoulders, and walked toward the massive mahogany double doors. The lobby smelled of fresh lavender and expensive wood polish. Enormous crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a warm golden glow over the plush velvet seating areas. I walked straight to the front desk, projecting an air of absolute calm and quiet authority. An older woman with silver hair perfectly styled into a bob stood behind the marble counter. Her brass name tag read Helen. She offered me a polished, welcoming smile. "Good morning, how can I assist you today?" Helen asked in a soft, melodic voice. I smiled back, mirroring her polite but detached professionalism. "Good morning. My husband and I stayed here a little while ago, and I am currently reviewing our monthly credit card statements for our personal accounting. There seems to be a duplicate room service charge from your resort that posted to our joint account. My husband is traveling for work this morning, so he asked me to swing by and get an itemized folio to clear up the discrepancy with our bank." Helen nodded sympathetically. "Oh, I am so sorry for the inconvenience. Our billing system went through a software update last month, and a few folios were accidentally double-billed. I can absolutely look that up and print a detailed receipt for you to take to your bank. Do you have the card that was charged, or perhaps the reservation confirmation number. I reached into my purse, pulled out the green plastic keycard I had found hidden in the lining of Brad's Old Navy bankruptcy suit, and placed it on the cool marble counter. I do not have the reservation number on hand, but I found the spare room key in his luggage when he was packing. Can you swipe it to pull up the record? Of course, Helen said, taking the card. She swiped it through the magnetic reader attached to her terminal. Her fingers tapped rapidly across the keyboard as she scanned the monitor. A moment later, her face softened into an expression of genuine warm recognition. "Oh, Mr. Evans," Helen said, her voice lifting with immediate familiarity. "Yes, of course. I remember him perfectly. You stayed with us in the Lakefront Executive Suite last month." My heart slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I kept my posture rigid and my expression mildly pleasant. "Yes, the Lakefront Executive Suite," I replied, smoothly, acting as if I knew exactly what she was talking about, acting as if I knew my husband was spending thousands of dollars on luxury suites while I was packing cheap lunches to save money. Helen smiled warmly, completely unaware of the devastating bomb she was casually constructing. "He is just the most wonderful man. When the billing system caused that little glitch during your checkout, he was so patient and polite about it. We get a lot of demanding, difficult guests here, but your husband was an absolute gentleman. He even tipped the housekeeping staff extra because of all the mess with the baby." The word baby hit my ears like a physical blow. The air in my lungs turned to ice. I forced myself to keep breathing, digging my fingernails so deeply into the palms of my hands, hidden inside my coat pockets, that they almost broke the skin. "Babies certainly do require a lot of extra towels," I managed to say, pushing the words out through a throat that felt like it was closing shut. Helen laughed, a bright, cheerful sound. "They certainly do, but it is entirely worth it. And speaking of which, I am so glad you came in today." She turned away from the terminal and opened a wide drawer beneath the counter. I stood completely frozen, watching her pull out a large manila envelope. She set it on the marble counter between us. "Your husband left this in a folder by the pool cabana on your last afternoon here," Helen explained, opening the flap of the envelope. One of the pool attendants found it and turned it into the lost and found desk. We tried calling the primary contact number on file, but it went straight to a full voicemail box. I recognized the two of you immediately when I saw it. We were hoping you would come back soon so we could return it safely. She reached into the envelope. "Your baby is absolutely beautiful," she added casually. "You have a gorgeous family." Helen slid a glossy 5x7 photograph across the marble counter. Time completely stopped. The ambient noise of the luxury lobby, the soft classical piano music playing from the hidden speakers, the quiet murmur of wealthy guests passing behind me, everything faded into a distant, muted hum. I stared down at the photograph. It was a candid, beautifully lit picture taken by the resort pool. In the center of the frame was my husband, Brad. He was shirtless, wearing expensive designer swim trunks, his skin tanned and glowing in the bright afternoon sun. He was looking down with an expression of pure, unadulterated joy. It was a look of profound, vulnerable adoration that I had never once seen him direct at me in 5 long years of marriage. In his arms, he was securely holding a chubby, blonde-haired little boy. The baby was laughing, his tiny hands reaching up to playfully pull on Brad's sunglasses. The child looked to be exactly 1 year old, but it was the woman in the photograph that made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. She was standing very close to Brad, her body pressed intimately against his bare side. She was wearing a red designer bikini. Her head was tilted back in joyous laughter, and one of her hands was resting possessively on Brad's bare chest. She looked radiant, wealthy, and completely carefree. It was not a stranger. It was not a random mistress he had picked up at a hotel bar. It was Haley, my younger sister, my 27-year-old sister, the golden child of our family, the sister who had sat across from me at Sunday dinner just a few days ago, complaining bitterly about the financial struggles of being a single mother, the sister who constantly criticized my frugal, practical lifestyle. The sister my parents worshipped, indulged, and protected at all costs. I stared at Haley's smiling face in the photograph, and a horrifying, devastating timeline began to snap together in my mind with brutal clarity. 2 years ago, Haley had tearfully told my parents she was suffering from severe emotional burnout and deep depression. She claimed she desperately needed to find herself. She asked them to fund a soul-searching gap year in Europe so she could heal. My parents, Thomas and Susan, had immediately agreed. They emptied a significant portion of their own savings accounts to pay for what they believed was a healing journey across Italy and France. Haley had sent us generic updates, sparse text messages, and a few stock-looking photos of European landmarks. She claimed her phone was broken and the international cellular service was terrible, which explained why we rarely spoke on a voice call. She was gone for an entire year. When she finally returned home, she came back holding a newborn baby. She told us all a heartbreaking, incredibly detailed story about volunteering at a rural women's shelter abroad. She claimed she had adopted the child from a desperate teenage girl who could not care for him. My parents had welcomed the boy with open arms, weeping with joy, praising Haley for her huge charitable heart. They called her an absolute angel. They told everyone at our church how proud they were of her selflessness. She never went to Europe. She had been hiding out, fully funded by my parents' hard-earned money, carrying my husband's child. I looked back down at the chubby 1-year-old boy in the photograph, the boy who was supposed to be a random European orphan. Liam. He had Brad's nose. He had Brad's exact eye shape. The physical resemblance was so undeniably obvious now that I was looking at them side by side in the picture. The biological truth was staring me right in the face. They had been living a complete elaborate lie right in front of me, while I was working 60-hour weeks at the bank, wearing worn-out shoes, denying myself every luxury, and agonizing over our household budget to pay off Brad's massive commercial debts. My husband was playing house with my sister. He was raising a family with her. They were bringing their secret child to luxury resorts, charging the expensive rooms to hidden credit cards, and posing for happy family portraits by the pool, while I sat in a quiet house waiting for him to come home from work. "Here's the itemized folio you requested," Helen said, her polite voice snapping me violently back to the present moment. She placed a printed sheet of paper on the counter next to the photograph. "I hope this clears up the duplicate charge issue for your husband. Have a wonderful day." I did not speak. I could not trust my vocal cords to produce a single sound without breaking into a scream. I slowly reached out with trembling fingers and picked up the photograph. I placed it carefully inside my purse next to the green hotel key. Then I took the printed receipt, folded it neatly, and slipped it into my pocket. I offered Helen a tight mechanical smile, gave her a single silent nod, and turned away from the marble desk. I walked out of the lobby. My legs moved automatically, carrying me across the heavy carpets, through the grand mahogany doors, and out into the bright, blinding sunshine of the courtyard. The heat of the morning hit my face, but I felt like I was trapped in a freezing blizzard. I walked across the vast parking lot until I reached my old rattling sedan. I unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and slammed the door shut. The isolation of the car finally broke the dam. I gripped the steering wheel with both hands. I gripped it so hard, my knuckles turned completely white, my nails digging deep into the cheap synthetic leather cover. I pressed my forehead against the top of the steering wheel, closing my eyes as a massive, crushing tidal wave of betrayal washed over me. It was a suffocating pressure in my chest. My own husband and my own flesh and blood. They had made me the ultimate fool. The air in the car felt too thick to breathe, but I forced air into my lungs. Slowly, the unbearable sadness began to evaporate. It was violently pushed aside by a burning, deeply calculating fury. I was a loan underwriter. I destroyed fraudsters for a living, and I was going to destroy them. 48 hours can feel like an entire lifetime when you are suffocating under the weight of a monumental lie. Sunday morning arrived with a blinding, cheerful sunlight that felt like a personal insult to my shattered reality. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, carefully applying an extra layer of foundation to hide the dark shadows under my eyes. I practiced my smile in the reflection. It had to be completely flawless. Today was our traditional Sunday dinner at my parents' house, a weekly ritual that was an unbreakable law in our family. For years, I had cherished these Sunday afternoons. They were a time of warmth roasted beef and familiar, comforting conversations. Now I was preparing to walk into a house full of people I deeply loved, armed with the sickening knowledge that two of them were actively dismantling my entire existence. I rode to church in the passenger seat of our car, listening to Brad hum a cheerful tune along to the radio. He looked incredibly handsome in his tailored charcoal suit, playing the part of the devoted, successful husband to absolute perfection. We sat in our usual pew, and he held my hand, resting it on his knee for the entire congregation to see. The pastor delivered a passionate sermon on the virtues of honesty and the sacred, unbreakable bond of marriage. I stared straight ahead at the stained glass windows, keeping my face perfectly composed, while my stomach churned with a toxic burning mixture of profound grief and sheer absolute rage. I was auditing my own life, and the ledger was entirely fraudulent. After the service, we drove to my parents' house in the quiet tree-lined suburbs. My mother, Susan, opened the front door before we even reached the porch. The rich, savory aroma of her famous pot roast and baking bread spilled out into the afternoon air. My father, Thomas, was sitting in his favorite leather armchair in the living room reading the Sunday paper. But the center of attention, as always, was my younger sister, Haley. She was sitting on the plush living room rug, softly cooing and playing with the 1-year-old baby boy she claimed to have adopted. Haley looked up as we walked in, flashing her bright, effortless smile. She played the role of the exhausted but noble single mother flawlessly. 2 years ago, she had spun a tragic, beautiful tale for our family. She told my parents that during her soul-searching trip to Europe, she had volunteered at a rural crisis center. She claimed she had bonded with a desperate, impoverished teenage girl who could not care for her newborn son. Haley told us she had stepped up, spent all her remaining travel money on international lawyers, and brought the boy home to give him a better life. My parents had wept tears of immense pride. They praised God for blessing their youngest daughter with such a profoundly charitable heart. They constantly held her up as a saint. I looked down at the little boy sitting on the rug. Liam. He had bright blue eyes and soft blonde hair. I stared at the shape of his nose, the curve of his jaw, and the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed. I felt a sharp, agonizing stab in my chest. He was beautiful. He was an innocent child brought into a web of deceit. He was also undeniably, unequivocally, the biological son of the man standing right next to me. Brad immediately dropped his keys on the entry table and walked straight over to the rug. He crouched down, his face lighting up with a wide, genuine grin. "Hey there, little buddy," Brad said softly, holding out his hands. Liam immediately giggled and reached his chubby arms up toward Brad. I stood by the door watching my husband interact with my sister and their secret child. My mother walked out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, completely oblivious to the tragedy unfolding in her own living room. She beamed at the sight of Brad playing with Liam, telling me how lucky I was to have a husband who was so incredibly natural with children. I forced my practiced smile into place, nodded in agreement, and walked into the kitchen to help carry the serving dishes to the dining room. We gathered around the large oak dining table. My father carved the roast, and we all held hands to say grace. I closed my eyes, feeling the warmth of Brad's hand tightly grasping my left hand, while his right hand held Haley's. The hypocrisy of the moment was almost physically unbearable. As the meal began, the sound of clinking silverware and light-hearted chatter filled the room. I shifted into a silent, hyper-vigilant state of observation. In my career as a loan underwriter, I evaluate risk by looking for tiny inconsistencies, the small details that do not add up on a balance sheet. Today I was applying those same forensic skills to my own family dinner. I watched the micro-expressions. I noticed the way Brad's eyes constantly tracked Haley whenever she reached across the table for the salt or the butter. It was not the casual glance of a brother-in-law. It was a lingering, possessive gaze. I noticed the subtle, almost imperceptible way Haley adjusted her posture whenever Brad spoke, leaning slightly toward him, her voice dropping to a softer, more intimate register. They were being careful, but they were incredibly arrogant. They believed they were the smartest people in the room, operating under the assumption that I was simply too trusting and too naive to ever connect the dots. Halfway through the meal, Liam, who was sitting in a high chair next to Haley, became fussy. He started to whine, squirming against the plastic straps, rejecting the mashed potatoes my mother was trying to feed him. Haley sighed dramatically, acting frustrated and overwhelmed. She complained about how little sleep she had gotten the night before playing her martyr role to perfection. Without a single second of hesitation, Brad pushed his chair back and stood up. "Let me take him for a minute," Brad said smoothly. "You eat your dinner, Haley. You need a break." Brad scooped the crying baby out of the high chair. I sat perfectly still, my fork hovering over my plate, watching every single movement my husband made. Brad did not hold the boy with the awkward, hesitant stiffness of an uncle. He tucked Liam securely against his chest, supporting the back of the baby's head with his large hand. He began to sway back and forth in a slow, rhythmic motion, making a very specific, low, shushing sound. He patted Liam's back with a steady, practiced tempo. Within seconds, the crying stopped entirely. Liam rested his small head against Brad's shoulder, completely content and safe in his father's arms. It was a display of pure, undeniable muscle memory. You do not learn how to soothe a child like that overnight. That kind of synchronized, instinctual comfort only comes from spending countless hours walking the floors in the middle of the night. It comes from being a parent. The realization hit my chest like a physical blow. While I was working late at the bank reviewing loan applications to pay off the commercial debt that had almost destroyed him, Brad had been pacing the floors of a hidden apartment, rocking his secret son to sleep. My mother clasped her hands together, her eyes shining with adoration. "Oh, Brad, you are just an absolute natural," she gushed. "Emily, you two really need to hurry up and give us a grandchild. Brad would make the most wonderful father." I felt a surge of nausea so intense I had to grip the edge of the heavy oak table to keep my hands from shaking. I forced a polite, tight laugh. "We are focusing on our careers right now, Mom," I said smoothly. "We have plenty of time." I reached for my glass of ice water, but my fingers intentionally grazed the edge of my cloth napkin, sending it fluttering to the hardwood floor. I mumbled a quick apology and ducked beneath the table to retrieve it. Down in the shadows, away from the bright dining room lights, my eyes adjusted to the space under the table. What I saw confirmed every terrible suspicion I harbored. Brad was sitting right next to Haley. His expensive leather dress shoe was completely slipped off his heel. His stocking foot was stretched across the space between their chairs, resting intimately against Haley's bare ankle. As I watched his foot slowly and deliberately stroked against her skin, Haley did not flinch. She did not pull away. She leaned into the touch, entirely comfortable with the secret physical contact happening just inches beneath my parents' fine china. I grabbed my napkin, gripping the white fabric so hard my knuckles popped. The sheer audacity of their behavior was breathtaking. They were violating my marriage and disrespecting my parents in the very house where we had grown up. I took a deep, steadying breath, commanded my facial muscles to relax, and sat back up in my chair. I placed the napkin on my lap and took a slow sip of water, looking directly at Brad. He smiled back at me, his eyes completely clear and innocent. I realized then that I was not dealing with a man who had made a single regrettable mistake. I was dealing with a cold, calculating predator. The plates were eventually cleared away, and my mother brought out her famous homemade peach cobbler and a fresh pot of coffee. The atmosphere in the room shifted to that lazy, comfortable Sunday afternoon feeling. Haley cleared her throat, tapping her spoon gently against her coffee mug to get our attention. Her face was flushed with an excited, triumphant glow. "I actually have some incredibly exciting news to share with everyone," Haley announced, looking proudly around the table. My mother gasped, clapping her hands together in anticipation. My father leaned forward, smiling at his favorite daughter. "I just put down an earnest money deposit on a house," Haley said, her voice ringing with pride. "And not just any house. I am buying one of the new luxury builds over in the Whispering Pines development. It is fully finalized. The closing date is set for the end of next month." My mother burst into happy tears, rushing out of her chair to throw her arms around Haley's neck. My father beamed, praising God for blessing Haley's hard work. Whispering Pines was an exclusive, highly sought-after gated community on the affluent side of the city. The homes there were massive custom-built estates featuring manicured lawns, neighborhood security, and elite country club amenities. "That is absolutely wonderful, sweetheart," my father said, his chest puffing out with pride. "We always knew your online clothing boutique would take off eventually. The Lord always rewards those who do good deeds." I sat at the table, a polite, frozen smile plastered across my face, while my professional banking brain immediately went to work, tearing her story into absolute shreds. I underwrite residential mortgages for a living. I know exactly what it takes to secure a home loan in a premium zip code like Whispering Pines. The base model homes in that specific development started at $800,000. Haley ran an online clothing boutique that sold cheap imported fast fashion. I had seen her tax returns 2 years ago when I helped her organize her basic finances. Her business barely generated enough net profit to cover the monthly rent on her modest two-bedroom apartment, let alone groceries, car payments, and the massive expenses of raising a toddler. You cannot walk into a legitimate financial institution and fake an $800,000 mortgage approval. The bank requires strict proof of income, 2 years of verified tax returns, a pristine credit history, and a substantial traceable cash down payment. Usually for a house of that magnitude, a self-employed buyer with limited income history would need to put down at least 20% in pure cash just to get the underwriters to look at the file. That meant Haley needed to produce a minimum of $160,000 in liquid cash simply to close the deal. Where does an unemployed single mother suddenly acquire nearly $200,000 in untraceable cash? I slowly turned my head and looked at my husband. Brad was smiling, clapping his hands and congratulating Haley along with my parents. But I noticed the subtle, rigid tension in his jawline. I saw him reach up and subtly wipe a single bead of sweat from his left temple before taking a long, hurried gulp of his ice water. He avoided making direct eye contact with me, keeping his gaze firmly fixed on my sister. The pieces of the financial puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying speed and clarity. Brad was a real estate broker. He knew the housing market, he knew how escrows worked, and he knew how to move money. My entire salary went directly into our joint checking account every 2 weeks. I lived frugally, assuming our savings were growing safely in the high-yield investment portfolios Brad managed for our future. I trusted him to handle the wealth I was steadily building. The cash was not coming from a sudden surge in Haley's online clothing sales. The massive down payment was coming from him. He was financing this luxury lifestyle. He was buying a sprawling estate in a gated community for his secret family using the financial foundation that I had broken my back to build. As I sat there, eating my mother's peach cobbler, listening to them discuss paint colors and nursery decorations for the new house, the final layer of my shock completely evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, calculating and entirely ruthless clarity. They thought they had secured their perfect future. They thought I was nothing more than a blind, hard-working fool funding their luxury. But they had made one fatal, catastrophic mistake. They forgot that I am a senior loan underwriter. I follow the money, I find the fraud, and I am the one who always gets the final signature. The fluorescent lights of the regional bank branch hummed with a sterile and indifferent energy as I walked to my desk on Monday morning. Usually the start of the work week brought a sense of structured comfort to my life. I loved the predictability of numbers, the rigid honesty of a balance sheet, and the quiet satisfaction of approving a deserving family for their first home. Today, however, the familiar sounds of ringing telephones and the low chatter of my colleagues felt entirely detached from my reality. I sat down in my ergonomic mesh chair and placed my purse in the bottom drawer, my fingers briefly brushing against the hidden pocket where the green hotel, keycard, and the glossy photograph now lived. My hands were remarkably steady. The paralyzing shock of Sunday dinner had burned off over a sleepless night, leaving behind a cold and razor-sharp clarity. I poured myself a cup of bitter black coffee from the break room, returned to my cubicle, and woke up my dual monitors. As a senior loan underwriter, I possess high-level clearance within our financial databases. I have the authority to bypass standard customer service protocols to verify credit histories, track asset transfers, and scrutinize the deepest layers of an individual's financial footprint. I have spent years using these tools to protect the bank from fraudsters. Today, I was going to use them to audit my own husband. I typed Brad's social security number into the Global Credit Inquiry Terminal. I had memorized those 9 digits years ago when I was filling out the agonizing bankruptcy paperwork to save him from his own reckless failures. The system loaded for a few tense seconds, a small blue circle spinning on the screen before laying out his entire financial existence in stark black and white rows. I scrolled past his pristine credit score, a score he only achieved because I had meticulously managed our household budget and paid every single bill on time for 5 years. I bypassed his standard auto loan and his modest business credit lines. Then my eyes locked onto the pending inquiries section. A massive glaring alert sat right at the top of the queue. It was an active fast-tracked application for a home equity line of credit, commonly known as a HELOC. The requested amount was $600,000. The blood drained from my face, leaving my cheeks feeling like ice. I stared at the screen, my underwriter brain instantly processing the catastrophic magnitude of what I was looking at. A HELOC is essentially a second mortgage. It allows a homeowner to borrow against the equity they have built up in their property. The house Brad and I lived in, the house I had contributed every spare dime of my salary toward maintaining and upgrading, was completely paid off. We had no mortgage because the sale of my grandmother's farm had covered the initial purchase outright. Brad was currently using the pristine equity of our shared marital home as collateral to extract over $500,000 in liquid cash. He was literally stealing the roof over my head to fund his secret life. The physical reaction was severe. My stomach pitched violently and a sharp metallic taste flooded the back of my throat. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my scalding coffee, forcing the physical panic back down into the dark pit of my stomach. I clicked on the digital file attached to the loan application to open the scanned documents. My mouse cursor hovered over the screen as page after page of dense legal text appeared. Brad had submitted this application to a completely different, aggressive online lending institution, clearly hoping the digital distance would keep the paperwork off my professional radar. I read through his fabricated income declarations and his vastly inflated business revenue projections. He was lying to the lender, padding his real estate commissions to easily qualify for the massive monthly repayment bracket. But the financial embellishments were nothing compared to the absolute horror waiting for me on page 14 of the document packet. The authorization to encumber the property required the legal consent of all titled owners. My name was on the deed of our house. Therefore, the lender required a notarized signature from Emily Evans. I scrolled down to the bottom of the page. There in the designated box was my signature. It was a beautiful, sweeping, perfectly replicated forgery of my handwriting. Brad had practiced the exact loop of my cursive letters, the specific slant I used when signing checks. It was so impeccably done that a standard bank clerk would never have questioned it. Beside the signature sat a bright, official-looking digital notary stamp. I zoomed in on the stamp. It belonged to a man named Gregory Sutton, an old college buddy of Brad's who currently ran a shady auto dealership across town. Brad had not just forged my name to steal my house. He had conspired with a corrupt friend to illegally notarize a fraudulent federal banking document. I sat back in my mesh chair, the harsh glare of the monitors reflecting off my retinas. The sheer calculating evil of his plan was breathtaking. Brad was not just having a foolish, impulsive affair with my younger sister. He was not just caught up in a momentary lapse of judgment. This was a premeditated, highly organized financial execution. He was deliberately draining every single drop of financial security I possessed to purchase an $800,000 luxury estate in Whispering Pines for Haley and his illegitimate son. He intended to walk away and start a brand new wealthy life, leaving me trapped with a $600,000 lien on a house I could never afford to pay off alone. He was going to let the bank foreclose on my home, effectively destroying my pristine credit and my career as a loan underwriter, all while he lived happily in a gated community with my golden child sister. He viewed my life, my youth, and my grandmother's inheritance as nothing more than an ATM to fund his actual desires. For one wild, blinding moment, my emotions entirely hijacked my rational brain. A massive surge of raw, unadulterated fury roared through my veins. I wanted to grab my desk phone and call the online lender immediately. I wanted to scream into the receiver that the application was entirely fraudulent, that my signature was a blatant forgery, and that they needed to cancel the underwriting process this exact second. I wanted to call the local police department and send a squad car to Brad's polished real estate office to drag him out in handcuffs. I wanted to drive to my parents' house, kick the front door open, and show them exactly what their precious saintly daughter and my perfect husband were doing behind their backs. My hand actually reached out and hovered over the receiver of my phone. But then the disciplined, highly trained underwriter inside my mind slammed on the brakes. I froze. I pulled my hand back from the phone and laced my fingers together tightly on my lap. I began to run the risk assessment of an immediate confrontation. If I called the lender and stopped the loan right now, the application would simply be flagged and quietly cancelled. Brad would receive an automated denial notice. He would immediately know that I had discovered his scheme. He would panic, run home, and start destroying evidence. He would gaslight me, telling my parents I was crazy and paranoid. He would say the loan application was just a draft, a mistake, or identity theft from a random hacker. My sister would cry her crocodile tears, and my parents would absolutely believe her over me. Brad would quietly transfer whatever liquid cash we had left, pack his bags, and disappear with Haley before I could ever get a lawyer to freeze our accounts. Stopping him now would only give him a scraped knee. I did not want to scrape his knee. I wanted to completely obliterate his entire world. I stared at the forged signature on the monitor, my breathing slowing down to a calm, steady rhythm. The law is a very specific, unforgiving machine. Right now, this was just an application. It was a forgery, yes, but proving intent and securing a major conviction of a cancelled digital document would be a long, exhausting civil battle. However, if I did absolutely nothing, if I let the underwriting process run its natural course, the bank would approve the file. They would release the funds. $600,000 would drop directly into Brad's personal checking account. And the exact moment he hit a button on his keyboard to wire those stolen funds across state lines to the escrow account for Haley's new luxury house, the nature of the crime would fundamentally change. It would instantly escalate from a local civil dispute into a massive, undeniable case of federal wire fraud and interstate bank fraud. It would trigger automatic federal jurisdiction. The federal authorities do not care about family drama or crying sisters. They only care about the unalterable path of stolen money. I reached out and quietly closed the browser window, wiping my search history from the terminal to ensure no trace of my audit remained. I adjusted my posture, rolled my shoulders back, and took a deep breath of the recycled office air. I was going to let him do it. I was going to let my husband forge my name. I was going to let him believe he was a genius who had successfully outsmarted his boring, trusting wife. I was going to let him construct his beautiful, expensive house of cards right up until the very last second. And then I was going to introduce him to the devastating consequences of underestimating the woman who balanced the books. The rest of the workday passed in a bizarre, almost surreal blur. I reviewed files, answered emails, and smiled at my coworkers in the break room, all while carrying the heaviest, darkest secret of my life. My phone buzzed on my desk around noon. It was a text from Brad. He was asking if I wanted him to pick up some takeout for dinner tonight. I read the message, picturing him sitting in his office typing those words while actively plotting to leave me destitute and homeless. I typed my reply with steady fingers. Yes, that sounds wonderful. I love you. I sent the message and turned my phone face down. The trap was officially set, and I was going to make sure the jaws snapped shut with absolute inescapable precision. Tuesday morning brought a heavy, relentless rain that battered against the thick glass windows of my office building. The gloomy weather perfectly matched the cold, hollow feeling that had settled permanently in my chest. I sat at my desk before the dual monitors, holding a mug of black coffee that had long since gone cold. The bank was quiet at this hour. The usual chaotic symphony of ringing phones and chattering loan officers had not yet begun. This gave me the perfect, undisturbed environment to do what I needed to do. I was a senior underwriter, which meant I had high-level security clearance to navigate through complex financial networks. I was trained to follow the money. I was trained to find the hidden truth buried beneath layers of fabricated tax returns and inflated income statements. Yesterday, I had uncovered Brad's fraudulent application for a home equity line of credit. Today, I needed to know exactly how deep his financial deception truly went. I logged into the global commercial banking portal. I bypassed Brad's personal checking and savings accounts, moving directly toward his business profiles. Brad ran a boutique real estate firm, but he also maintained several limited liability companies to manage his various property flips and investment ventures. Most of these accounts carried minimal balances, serving simply as pass-through entities for his business expenses. I clicked through them systematically, my eyes scanning the digital ledgers with practiced efficiency. I opened the file for an entity named Summit Enterprise Holdings. Brad had registered this specific company 3 years ago, right around the time I was draining my grandmother's inheritance to save him from bankruptcy. He had always claimed Summit Enterprise Holdings was a dormant account, a placeholder for a future commercial venture that had never materialized. The screen refreshed, displaying the transaction history for the past 30 days. I expected to see a zero balance, I expected to see nothing but a line of monthly maintenance fees automatically deducted by the bank. Instead, my eyes locked onto the pending transactions column. Sitting right at the top of the ledger were two massive incoming wire transfers. The funds had been initiated late Monday afternoon and were currently sitting in the clearinghouse, waiting to be formally posted to Brad's account. The first wire was for $250,000. The second wire was for $150,000. My breath caught in my throat. $400,000 in pure liquid cash was about to drop into a supposedly dormant business account. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I clicked on the transaction details to trace the origination of the funds. In the banking world, money never simply appears out of thin air. Every single digital cent leaves a footprint. Every wire transfer carries a specific routing transit number that identifies the exact financial institution where the money originated. I highlighted the routing number attached to the incoming $400,000 and ran it through the institutional database. The search result popped up instantly. The money was not coming from a wealthy private investor. It was not coming from a corporate real estate trust. The routing number belonged to a small regional credit union based in our local suburb. It was a modest conservative financial institution known for handling pension funds and working-class retirement accounts. It was the exact credit union where my father had done his banking for the past 40 years. A sudden, terrifying chill radiated down my spine. My hands began to tremble as I clicked on the final layer of the wire transfer authorization file. The screen displayed the names of the primary account holders who had authorized the massive release of funds. The names staring back at me were Thomas and Susan, my parents. I pushed my chair back from the desk, my hand flying up to cover my mouth. The air in my office suddenly felt impossibly thin. I could hear the harsh, rapid sound of my own breathing echoing in my ears. $400,000 was not just a random sum of money. I knew exactly what that specific number represented. It was the exact combined total of my parents' entire life savings. My father, Thomas, had worked for 35 years as a floor manager at a regional manufacturing plant. He woke up at 4 o'clock every single morning, putting on heavy steel-toed boots and coming home with calloused, grease-stained hands. He had ruined his knees and his lower backs, standing on concrete floors for decades to provide for our family. My mother, Susan, had worked just as hard. She spent 30 years as a dedicated pediatric nurse at the local public school, wiping runny noses, treating scraped knees, and stretching her modest public servant salary to ensure Haley and I always had warm clothes and food on the table. They drove a 10-year-old Buick. They clipped grocery coupons. They never took extravagant vacations or bought luxury goods. Every single spare dollar they earned had been meticulously funneled into their joint retirement accounts. That $400,000 was their absolute security. It was the money they had painstakingly hoarded to ensure they would never be a burden to their children in their old age. And now, every last cent of their lifelong sacrifice was sitting in a pending wire transfer, waiting to clear into my husband's private business account. I grabbed my desk phone. My hands were shaking so violently, I misdialed the familiar number twice before finally getting it right. I pressed the receiver to my ear, listening to the phone ring, praying desperately that there was a logical explanation, praying that this was some bizarre administrative error. The phone clicked, and my mother's warm, cheerful voice filled the line. "Good morning, Emily, sweetie. I am so glad you called. Your father and I were just sitting down to have our morning coffee." I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting back the immediate urge to sob. "Good morning, Mom," I said, forcing my professional underwriter voice to take absolute control of my vocal cords. "I need to ask you a question, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you and Dad recently authorize a wire transfer to Brad's business account?" There was a brief, lighthearted chuckle on the other end of the line. "Oh, Brad told you about the big investment. We were going to surprise you this weekend at Sunday dinner." "Yes, honey, we did. Your husband is absolutely brilliant, Emily. You are so lucky to have a man who looks out for his family the way he does." My stomach plummeted. I dug my fingernails into my thigh to keep myself from screaming. "Mom, what exactly did Brad tell you? Why did you send him your money?" My mother sighed a happy, contented sound. "Well, Haley actually brought it up to us a few weeks ago. She told us how much the economy is struggling, and she said she was so worried about our retirement funds losing value in those boring old mutual funds. She said Brad had access to an exclusive guaranteed commercial real estate fund that was strictly for high net worth investors. It yields a massive quarterly return. Haley told us Brad pulled some major strings to get our names on the list. We cashed out our entire retirement portfolio on Friday. Brad said the returns will be so high that your father and I can finally afford to take that cruise to Alaska we have always dreamed about. I felt physically sick. The room began to spin. Mom, you cashed out your entire retirement. You sent him everything. Yes, sweetheart, she replied proudly. Haley helped us fill out all the banking paperwork. She is such a smart girl. We are just so blessed to have a son-in-law who wants to build generational wealth for us. Do not worry about a thing, Emily. Brad promised us the principal investment is entirely, completely guaranteed. I could not breathe. I could literally feel the walls of my office closing in on me. I managed to murmur a few generic, polite agreements, telling my mother I loved her before I gently placed the receiver back onto the cradle. I sat in the sterile silence of the bank, completely paralyzed by the sheer, monstrous magnitude of the betrayal. The memories of the past few weeks suddenly rushed into my mind, locking together to form a horrifyingly clear picture. I remembered a quiet evening last month when Brad and Haley had cornered my parents in the living room while I was in the kitchen washing dishes. I remembered hearing Brad using his smooth, charismatic salesman voice. I remembered him using complex financial jargon, throwing around words like high-yield yields, insulated assets, and guaranteed returns. I remembered Haley sitting on the arm of my father's chair, resting her head on his shoulder, playing the part of the sweet, concerned youngest daughter. She had manipulated their deep-seated anxiety about growing older. She had preyed upon their absolute trust in their successful son-in-law. There was no exclusive commercial real estate fund. There was no guaranteed return. There was no Alaska cruise waiting for my hardworking parents in their twilight years. Brad and Haley had orchestrated a calculated, predatory scam to steal $400,000 in clean, liquid cash. They were not investing my parents' money. They were using it to furnish the massive $800,000 estate they were secretly buying in Whispering Pines. They were going to use my father's sweat and my mother's decades of nursing to buy luxury furniture, designer nursery decorations for their illegitimate baby, and a brand new life built entirely on a foundation of absolute theft. The psychological shift that happened inside my mind at that exact moment was violent and irreversible. Up until this point, the betrayal had been deeply personal. Finding the hotel key, seeing the photograph of my sister holding my husband's baby, discovering the forged home equity loan on my house. All of those things were an agonizing, heartbreaking betrayal of my marriage and my sisterly bond. They were the actions of a selfish, unfaithful husband and a jealous, entitled sister. I had been grieving the loss of my family. I had been mourning the 5 years I had wasted working myself to the bone to support a man who despised me. But this new discovery destroyed every single ounce of my grief. Stealing a wife's house is a civil marital dispute, but manipulating two elderly, trusting people into liquidating their lifetime pension is an entirely different category of evil. This was no longer just infidelity. This was elder financial abuse. It was a vicious, predatory crime. Brad and Haley had looked into the kind, aging faces of the parents who had provided for them, and they had consciously decided to strip them of their dignity and their survival money. They were entirely willing to let my mother and father starve in their old age so they could sleep in a master bedroom with a vaulted ceiling. The hot, agonizing tears that had been threatening to fall all morning completely vanished. The sadness evaporated from my chest, replaced by an expansive, chilling void. A cold, hardened layer of ice settled over my heart. I looked at the 2 pending wire transfers glowing brightly on my computer monitor. I felt a sudden, terrifying sense of total emotional detachment. I no longer saw my husband. I no longer saw my sister. I saw 2 criminals. I saw 2 parasites who had latched onto the host of my family and were actively sucking the lifeblood out of my parents. I reached out and placed my hands flat on the cool surface of my desk. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the air fill my lungs. My pulse steadied. My mind sharpened into a singular, focused point of absolute resolve. I was not going to cry anymore. I was not going to confront them and demand tearful explanations. I was not going to ask my sister why she hated me so much that she had to steal my husband and my parents' money. Their reasons no longer mattered. Their feelings were completely irrelevant. I was an underwriter. I lived my life in the black and white world of financial documentation. I knew the law, I knew the banking regulations, and I knew exactly how federal wire fraud was prosecuted. Brad believed he was a mastermind. He believed his smooth-talking charm and his tailored suits made him invincible. He thought he had outsmarted his boring, quiet wife. He thought he could rob my parents blind and simply walk away into the sunset. He was incredibly wrong. I opened a new, highly encrypted tab on my banking terminal. I began taking secure time-stamped screenshots of the pending wire transfers from my parents' credit union. I captured the exact routing numbers, the account origins, and the destination entity belonging to Brad. I created a secure digital file, slowly and methodically gathering every single piece of evidence. I pulled the fraudulent home equity application, highlighting the forged signature and the fake notary stamp. I documented the paper trail with meticulous, devastating precision. My parents had spent their entire lives protecting me. They had sacrificed their bodies and their comfort to ensure I had a safe roof over my head. Now it was my turn to protect them. I was going to let Brad and Haley believe their brilliant plan was succeeding. I was going to let them celebrate their stolen wealth. I was going to wait until the exact moment they felt completely secure, entirely untouchable. And then I was going to rain absolute hell down upon them. I was going to strip them of their freedom, their stolen house, and their arrogant pride. I gathered my purse, slipped the USB drive containing the evidence into the inner pocket, and prepared to make a phone call to a very specific, very ruthless attorney. The time for mourning was over. It was time to execute. The heavy wooden door of my younger sister's apartment complex was painted a peeling, faded yellow. I stood in the narrow hallway holding a large wicker gift basket overflowing with expensive organic cotton baby blankets, a plush stuffed bear, and a premium silicone teething ring. It was Tuesday evening. The air in the corridor smelled faintly of stale cooking oil and damp carpet. It was a stark, almost laughable contrast to the sprawling $800,000 luxury estate in Whispering Pines that she and my husband were secretly purchasing with my parents' stolen retirement funds. I adjusted the weight of the basket against my hip, took a slow, deep breath to steady my racing pulse, and knocked on the door. I needed absolute, undeniable leverage. The hidden hotel room key, the luxury resort photograph, and the forged home equity loan documents were devastating pieces of evidence. The pending wire transfers from my elderly parents' bank accounts proved the massive predatory financial fraud. But I knew exactly how my deeply religious, fiercely traditional parents operated. I knew how our church community functioned. If I walked into my parents' living room and simply threw financial documents onto the coffee table, Brad would deploy his silver-tongued charm. He would invent a highly plausible, incredibly complicated business excuse. He would claim the money was a legitimate investment bridging loan. He would look my mother in the eyes, swear on a Bible, and say the hotel photograph was just a harmless coincidence from a day trip. Haley would turn on her crocodile tears, playing the innocent, overwhelmed single mother who was simply trying to secure a future for her adopted European orphan. My parents would desperately want to believe them because the alternative was too horrifying for them to accept. I needed a weapon that could not be argued with, excused, or explained away by a clever salesman. I needed biological truth. I needed science. The door swung open, and Haley stood there, wearing a pair of worn leggings and an oversized, faded university sweatshirt. She had pulled her blonde hair into a messy knot at the top of her head. She looked perfectly exhausted, playing the role of the struggling, noble single mother to the absolute hilt. When she saw me standing there with the massive gift basket, her eyes widened in practiced surprise, and she broke into a wide, welcoming smile. "Emily," she gasped, reaching out to pull me into a quick, one-armed hug. "What are you doing here? You did not have to bring all of this." I smiled back, a perfectly constructed mask of older sisterly devotion. "I just wanted to drop by and see my favorite nephew," I said, stepping past her into the cramped living room. "And after the big announcement at Sunday dinner about the new house, I figured you could use some fresh supplies. Moving is always so stressful, especially with a little one." Haley closed the door and let out a long theatrical sigh. "It really is. I am just so overwhelmed with the packing and the mortgage paperwork, but I am so incredibly blessed. I just want Liam to have a beautiful yard to run around in." I nodded, maintaining steady eye contact, completely unfazed by her breathtaking hypocrisy. "Where is the little guy?" I asked brightly. "He is right here on the playmat," she said, gesturing toward the center of the small living room. Liam was sitting on a brightly colored foam mat, happily chewing on a blue plastic pacifier and stacking soft fabric blocks. I walked over and knelt down on the carpet beside him. Being this close to the child was a profound psychological torment. I looked into his bright blue eyes, tracing the exact curve of his jaw and the specific familiar shape of his brow. He was a beautiful, innocent child brought into this world completely unaware of the monstrous web of deceit his parents had spun around him. I felt a deep, hollow ache in my chest for the child he was, and a burning, righteous fury toward the people who had created him through such immense betrayal. Haley dropped onto the sofa behind me, rubbing her temples. "I am running on 3 hours of sleep," she complained softly. "He was up all night teething. I honestly do not know how I am going to survive the rest of the week." I turned to look at her, channeling every ounce of fake sympathy I could muster. "You look absolutely exhausted, Haley. Why do you not go into the kitchen and brew us a fresh pot of strong coffee? Take your time. I can watch Liam for a few minutes while you take a breather." She looked at me with genuine relief, completely falling for the trap. "Oh, Emily, you are a lifesaver. Thank you so much. I will be right back." Haley pushed herself off the sofa and walked into the small galley kitchen. The apartment layout worked perfectly in my favor. A short wall separated the kitchen counter from the living room, completely blocking her line of sight. I listened closely. I heard the sound of the kitchen faucet running, the clatter of a ceramic mug being pulled from a cabinet, and the distinct loud grinding noise of the coffee bean machine. I had exactly 60 seconds. I reached into my structured leather purse and swiftly pulled out a small sterile plastic zipper bag. I had taken it from the bank's first aid kit earlier that afternoon. I kept my eyes fixed on the kitchen wall, listening to the grinding coffee beans. I turned my attention back to the little boy sitting on the foam mat. Liam looked up at me, blinked his bright blue eyes, and pulled the blue plastic pacifier out of his mouth, dropping it onto the carpet next to his knee. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, echoing loudly in my own ears. I reached down my fingers, completely steady, and picked up the damp pacifier. I did not hesitate. I dropped it directly into the sterile zipper bag, sealed it tight, and shoved it deep into the hidden interior pocket of my purse. Immediately, I reached into the wicker gift basket I had brought. I pulled out the brand new premium silicone teething ring, still wrapped in his plastic packaging. I tore the packaging open, handed the fresh teething ring to Liam, and gave him a warm, encouraging smile. He grabbed the new toy happily and immediately put it into his mouth, completely forgetting about the old pacifier. By the time Haley walked back into the living room carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee, my purse was zipped shut, and I was casually stacking fabric blocks with her son. "Look at him, he already loves his new auntie," Haley said, smiling affectionately as she handed me a mug. "He's a very smart boy," I replied smoothly, taking a slow sip of the hot coffee. We chatted for another 20 minutes. She complained about the rising costs of childcare and the stress of organizing a moving truck. I listened, nodding sympathetically, offering generic advice, while the sterile plastic bag burned a metaphorical hole through the leather of my purse. I finished my coffee, gave Liam a gentle pat on the head, hugged my sister goodbye, and walked out the peeling yellow door. I drove back to my house with the radio turned off. The silence inside my car was heavy with anticipation. I had successfully secured the first half of the biological equation. Now I needed the second. Brad's car was not in the driveway when I arrived home. He had texted me earlier, claiming he had a late evening showing with an out-of-town commercial client. I knew perfectly well he was likely sitting in a dark booth at a high-end steakhouse, spending our money on expensive wine while finalizing the fraudulent paperwork to steal our home equity. His absence gave me the perfect undisturbed opportunity I needed. I walked upstairs into our master bathroom. I turned on the bright vanity lights and stared at the space. The bathroom was immaculate, smelling faintly of Brad's expensive sandalwood cologne and the lavender soap I always bought for him. It was a space designed for marital intimacy, and standing in it now made my skin crawl with disgust. I opened the top drawer of his wooden vanity cabinet. His personal grooming items were arranged with his usual meticulous care. I bypassed his expensive shaving kit and reached for his dark wooden hairbrush. I brought it up to the light, inspecting the bristles carefully. Brad was incredibly vain about his thick dark hair. He brushed it constantly. I opened the medicine cabinet and retrieved a pair of silver tweezers. I needed pure, uncontaminated genetic material. A loose hair without a follicle would not be sufficient for a highly accurate legal test. I used the sharp tips of the tweezers to carefully extract 5 long dark hairs that were deeply tangled at the very base of the brush bristles. I held them up to the vanity light. I could clearly see the tiny white bulbous root intact at the end of each strand. Perfect. I pulled a second sterile zipper bag from my pocket, dropped the hairs inside, and sealed it completely shut. I placed the brush exactly where I had found it and closed the vanity drawer. I walked into my home office, turned on my desk lamp, and sat down at my computer. Earlier that week, I had spent hours researching private forensic-level DNA testing laboratories. I bypassed the cheap commercial mail-in kits that people use for discovering their heritage. I needed a facility that handled legal custody disputes and strict chain of custody documentation. I had found a highly rated, discreet laboratory located 2 states away that promised expedited priority processing for a premium fee. I pulled out the required submission forms I had already printed. I filled out the paperwork with clinical detachment. I labeled the bag containing the pacifier as child sample A. I labeled the bag containing the hair roots as alleged father sample B. I paid the exorbitant $700 expedited testing fee using a secure prepaid digital credit card I had purchased with cash from a grocery store the day before. I was leaving absolutely no financial paper trail for Brad to accidentally discover on our joint banking statements. I packed the 2 sealed plastic bags and the formal paperwork into a heavy tamper-proof cardboard shipping envelope. The next morning, before driving to the bank, I stopped at a private shipping center across town. I handed the envelope to the clerk, paid for priority overnight delivery, and watched him drop it into the outgoing bin. The battle lines were officially drawn. All I could do now was wait. The next 5 days were an agonizing exercise in psychological endurance. Living in the same house, sleeping in the exact same bed as a man is actively destroying your life, requires a level of emotional compartmentalization that borders on sociopathy. I woke up every morning, made his coffee, and kissed his cheek before he left for the real estate office. I sat across from him at the dinner table, listening to him complain about difficult clients and slow escrow periods. I nodded, I smiled, and I played the role of the devoted, supportive wife to absolute perfection. Every single time he smiled at me, I thought about the forged signature on the $600,000 home equity loan. Every time he asked about my day at the bank, I thought about my parents cashing out their entire life savings. I channeled all my grief, all my righteous fury into a cold, unbreakable fortress inside my mind. I was no longer his wife. I was his auditor. On the 6th morning, I was sitting at my desk at the regional bank branch. I was in the middle of reviewing a routine commercial loan application when a notification pinged softly in the bottom right corner of my computer monitor. It was an incoming message to the secure encrypted email address I had set up specifically for the laboratory communication. The subject line simply read, "Confidential laboratory results, ready for review." My hands went completely numb. The background noise of the banking floor, the ringing telephones, the hum of the printers. Everything faded into total silence. I took a slow, deep breath of the cool, recycled office air. I moved my mouse cursor over the notification and clicked open the secure portal. I typed in my complex alphanumeric password. The screen loaded for a few agonizing seconds before a secured PDF document appeared on the screen. I clicked download. I opened the file. The document was highly formal, filled with complex genetic markers, allele sizes, and dense scientific terminology. I scrolled past the graphs and the detailed methodology sections, my eyes scanning rapidly down to the final page where the absolute conclusion was printed in bold black text. The forensic analysis of the submitted samples indicates that alleged father sample B cannot be excluded as the biological father of child sample A. Based on the genetic markers tested, the probability of paternity is 99.99%. I stared at the number, 99.99%. There was no longer any room for denial. There was no longer any shadow of a doubt, no lingering hope that I had somehow misunderstood the situation. The science was absolute. the child my sister paraded around at Sunday dinner, the child my parents wept over and called a blessing, was my husband's biological son. They had slept together. They had created a life together. They had conspired to hide it, and now they were conspiring to steal my home and my parents' future to fund their perfect wealthy escape. A single cold tear slipped down my cheek, but I quickly wiped it away with the back of my hand. The time for crying was permanently over. I pressed the print command on my keyboard. The heavy laser printer on the edge of my desk whirred to life, churning out 3 crisp, high-quality copies of the official laboratory results. I gathered the warm pages, stapled them neatly together, and slipped them into a thick manila folder. I placed the folder into my leather briefcase alongside the USB drive that contained the damning screenshots of the forged home equity loan and the fraudulent wire transfers from my parents' retirement accounts. I stood up from my desk, smoothed the wrinkles from my professional skirt, and walked out of my cubicle. I walked past my colleagues through the heavy glass doors of the underwriting department and straight down into the secure subterranean vault of the bank branch. I presented my identification to the vault manager. He nodded respectfully and escorted me through the massive time-steel doors. I walked down the rows of polished metal until I reached my personal safe deposit box. I inserted my brass key, turned the lock, and pulled the long metal drawer out. I placed the manila folder containing the DNA results and the USB drive directly into the bottom of the empty metal box. I closed the drawer, locked it securely, and slid the brass key back into my pocket. I walked out of the vault and back upstairs into the bright, busy lobby of the bank. The crushing weight of the unknown was completely gone. I knew exactly who Brad was. I knew exactly who Haley was. They believed they were the masterminds of a brilliant, flawless scheme. They believed they were going to walk away wealthy, happy, and entirely unpunished. I walked back to my desk, picked up my phone, and finally dialed the number for the most ruthless, aggressive corporate fraud attorney in the city. They wanted to steal my life. I was going to make sure they lost everything. The law offices of Mitchell Davis were located on the 42nd floor of a gleaming glass skyscraper in uptown Charlotte. I stepped out of the private elevator and into a reception area wrapped in dark mahogany and polished brass. This was not a standard family law practice. I was not looking for a soft-spoken mediator to help split our furniture and negotiate reasonable alimony payments. Mitchell Davis was a high-powered corporate litigator. He specialized in high-stakes financial fraud, aggressive asset recovery, and dismantling white-collar criminals. He was a ruthless shark who destroyed predatory executives for a living. Today, I was bringing him the most satisfying meal of his entire career. I walked past the quiet receptionist and was ushered immediately into his massive corner office overlooking the rain-slicked city. Mitchell Davis sat behind a sprawling wooden desk. He was a man in his late 50s with sharp gray eyes and a perfectly tailored dark suit. He did not offer empty platitudes or fake sympathy when I sat down. He simply pointed to the leather chair across from him and asked me to lay out exactly what I had discovered. I opened my heavy leather briefcase. I did not shed a single tear as I began to unpack the shattered remains of my life. I slid the glossy 5x7 photograph from the luxury resort across the polished wood. I placed the printed results from the expedited DNA laboratory right next to it, confirming the absolute biological truth that my husband was the father of my younger sister's child. Mitchell glanced at the documents, his face remaining a completely unreadable mask. Then I moved on to the financial warfare. I handed him the printed screenshots of the fraudulent home equity line of credit application. I pointed out the perfectly forged replica of my signature and the fake digital notary stamp provided by Brad's shady associate. Finally, I placed the most devastating piece of evidence on the desk. It was the transaction log showing the incoming wire transfers from my elderly parents' credit union. I explained how Brad and Haley had manipulated my mother and father into cashing out $400,000 of their hard-earned retirement funds. I detailed the fake commercial real estate fund Brad had invented to steal their life savings to purchase a luxury estate for his secret family. I explained how my parents had spent decades working brutal jobs just to save that money and how my husband and my sister were perfectly willing to leave them destitute. Mitchell leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers together. He looked at the mountain of undeniable proof, the meticulous documentation only a senior loan underwriter could gather, and a slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. He told me that I had handed him a masterpiece of criminal stupidity. If I had confronted Brad at Sunday dinner, it would have been a messy domestic dispute. My parents would have desperately wanted to believe my sister, and Brad would have used his salesman charm to gaslight everyone in the room. But by bringing the evidence directly to him, we were going to bypass the family drama entirely and build a federal cage. Mitchell outlined our counterattack strategy with cold, calculated precision. He explained that our absolute first priority was to completely insulate my personal wealth. He instructed me to immediately execute a post-nuptial asset freeze. We were going to quietly transfer all of my independent savings, my personal checking accounts, and the remaining inheritance from my grandmother into a legally protected blind trust. This specific maneuver would completely sever my financial exposure. If Brad attempted to access my personal funds or drain our joint accounts any further, he would hit a solid brick wall. The blind trust would shield my money from any fallout related to his massive debts. But the most terrifying and brilliant part of Mitchell's strategy involved the forged home equity loan. My professional banking instincts had been screaming at me to cancel the loan and lock down the house. I desperately wanted to alert the online lender that my signature was a blatant forgery and stop the entire process. Mitchell leaned forward and looked me directly in the eyes. He told me to do absolutely nothing. If we canceled the loan now, Brad would simply receive an automated denial notice. He would claim it was a draft error or blame the forgery on a desperate mortgage associate. He would play the victim, pack his bags, and run with the $400,000 he had already stolen from my parents. Mitchell wanted a conviction that carried mandatory federal prison time. He instructed me to let the bank fully approve the loan file. He told me to let the underwriter release the $600,000 directly into Brad's personal checking account. The exact second, Brad clicked a button on his computer to wire those stolen funds across state lines to the escrow account for Haley's new luxury house, the nature of the crime transformed. It would instantly escalate from a local civil dispute into a documented, undeniable case of federal wire fraud and interstate bank fraud. Mitchell promised me that the moment that money crossed state lines, the Federal Bureau of Investigation would take over the case. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, but it was a shiver of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I was agreeing to let my husband place a massive lien on my home trusting entirely in Mitchell's legal trap to save me, but Mitchell had one final layer of protection to ensure I was absolutely insulated from the debt. He pulled out a blank legal affidavit. He told me that Brad would inevitably need me to physically sign a final disbursement authorization to release the funds. Brad would likely try to slip the document into a stack of routine paperwork, relying heavily on my usual blind trust. Mitchell instructed me to sign the affidavit in front of him using my normal signature. Then he asked me to sign it again, but this time he told me to add a specific deliberate flaw. I chose to loop the bottom of my last name backward and entirely omit my middle initial. Mitchell notarized the affidavit and locked it in his safe. We officially pre-registered the altered signature as legally invalid. If that specific signature ever appeared on any financial document, it was immediate, indisputable proof that I was signing under fraudulent pretenses and the document was completely void. I left the towering glass building and drove back to my suburban house. The rain continued to pour down, washing the streets clean, perfectly mirroring the state of my mind. The emotional weight of the betrayal had completely hardened into an unbreakable, icy resolve. I was no longer a grieving wife mourning the loss of a failed marriage. I was a predator lying in wait. I walked into my kitchen and began preparing dinner exactly as I had done for the past 5 years. I chopped vegetables, seasoned chicken breasts, and boiled water for pasta. I moved with mechanical precision, listening to the sound of the rain against the roof. At 6 o'clock in the evening, the front door opened and Brad walked in. He tossed his keys onto the entry table and smiled at me. He looked perfectly tired, but deeply satisfied, like a man who believed all his grand plans were finally falling into place. He wrapped his arms around my waist and kissed my cheek. He told me he had a brilliant day at the office closing deals and securing our financial future. I forced my muscles to relax. I smiled brightly and asked him about his meetings, pouring him a generous glass of expensive red wine. We sat at the dining room table and ate our meal. He complained about the heavy traffic and talked excitedly about a new commercial property he was scouting out near the highway. I listened to his voice, marveling at the sheer breathtaking capacity of his deception. He was sitting across from me, drinking wine I had purchased, eating food I had carefully prepared, while actively plotting to leave me completely bankrupt and homeless. He looked at me with those charming eyes, entirely unaware that the woman he thought he was playing for a fool had spent her entire morning building his coffin. After I cleared the dinner plates and brought out our coffee, Brad casually unzipped his leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of papers bound together with a heavy black binder clip. He sighed dramatically, rubbing the back of his neck to feign extreme exhaustion. He told me his accountant was breathing down his neck about our quarterly business tax filings. He said there were a few routine addendums that required my signature as his legal spouse to ensure we maximized our joint deductions for the upcoming quarter. He pushed the stack of papers across the wooden table along with his expensive silver fountain pen. I looked down at the stack. The top pages were standard tax declaration forms filled with dense paragraphs regarding property depreciation and complex business expenses. I picked up the silver pen and began to slowly flip through the pages. I signed the first two tax forms with my normal everyday signature. Brad sat back in his chair, taking a slow sip of his coffee, watching me with a relaxed, confident expression. I turned to the fourth page, and my heart gave a single massive thump against my ribs. Buried right in the middle of the routine tax filings was a standard bank disbursement authorization form. It was the absolute final approval document required by the online lender to release the $600,000 from the home equity line of credit. The top of the page clearly stated that the massive sum of funds was to be wired directly to the Whispering Pines escrow and title company. Brad had seamlessly slipped the execution warrant for our marriage right into a stack of boring tax papers, absolutely certain that I would never read the fine print. I kept my breathing perfectly even. I did not pause my movements. I did not let my eyes widen or my hand shake. I looked up from the document and met Brad's gaze. His eyes were clear, bright, and completely devoid of any guilt or hesitation. I offered him my sweetest, most loving smile. I told him I was so incredibly proud of how hard he worked for our family and how much I trusted his financial vision. He smiled back, a smug, victorious look settling over his handsome face. He told me he was doing it all for us. I lowered my eyes back to this disbursement form. I gripped the silver fountain pen and pressed the sharp tip to the signature line. I deliberately looped the bottom of my last name backward. I intentionally omitted my middle initial. I executed the specifically altered, legally invalid signature flawlessly. I flipped past the fraudulent form and signed the final tax document with my normal handwriting. I neatly aligned the stack of papers, clipped them back together, and slid them across the table toward my husband. Brad let out a long, quiet breath of relief. He picked up the documents, tapped them against the table to straighten the edges, and slipped them securely back into his leather briefcase. He thanked me, telling me I was the best wife a man could ever ask for. I stood up and began clearing the coffee mugs, turning my back to him so he could not see the cold, triumphant expression settling over my features. He believed he had just secured his wealthy escape. He had no idea he had just signed his own federal prison sentence. The sharp, unexpected chime of the front doorbell sliced through the quiet sanctuary of my home on a Wednesday afternoon. I had taken the remainder of the week off from the bank, utilizing my accrued personal time to meticulously organize the mountain of financial evidence Mitchell Davis and I were building. I was sitting at the dining room table, surrounded by color-coded folders containing property records and wire transfer logs when the chime echoed through the hallway. I quickly gathered the sensitive documents, shoved them into my heavy leather briefcase, and locked it inside the hall closet. I walked softly toward the foyer and peered through the small glass peephole. Standing on my front porch, shielding her eyes from the bright afternoon sun, was my younger sister, Haley. She was entirely unannounced and completely uninvited. My banking brain immediately recognized this for what it was. This was not a friendly, impromptu family visit. This was a reconnaissance mission. Haley was here to gloat, to survey her territory, and to blindly ensure that her older, supposedly foolish sister was still sitting quietly in the dark. Before I even touched the brass handle of the front door, I turned around and walked purposefully back into the kitchen. My kitchen featured a large, heavy granite island where Brad and I often ate our morning meals. Taped securely to the underside of the stone overhang, completely invisible to the naked eye, was a high-grade voice-activated digital micro-recorder. Mitchell had instructed me to document every single interaction moving forward. In the world of financial fraud and conspiracy, verbal admissions of receiving illicit funds were the golden nails in the coffin. I reached under the cool stone surface, my fingers brushing against a small plastic device, and pressed the activation button. The tiny red indicator light blinked twice, confirming the room was now live. I smoothed the front of my casual sweater, pasted a look of mild, pleasant surprise across my face, and walked back to open the front door. Haley breezed into my foyer, carrying a designer leather handbag that easily cost 3 months of a standard mortgage payment. She was dressed in a pristine cream-colored cashmere lounge set that looked utterly impractical for a mother raising a 1-year-old toddler. She smelled intensely of expensive floral perfume and fresh espresso. She looked like a woman who had just won the lottery, practically vibrating with a smug, deeply satisfied energy. "Emily!" she gasped, throwing her arms around my shoulders in a brief, entirely hollow hug. I was just driving through the neighborhood after a meeting with my interior designer, and I realized I had not seen you since Sunday dinner. You ran out of Mom and Dad's house so quickly after dessert. I wanted to make sure you were doing okay. I stepped back, allowing her to fully enter the space. "I am doing just fine, Haley. I had a terrible migraine on Sunday evening and just needed to get home to rest in the quiet. Please come into the kitchen. Let me pour you a glass of iced tea." She followed me into the kitchen, her expensive leather boots clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She did not simply walk into the room. She surveyed it. I watched her eyes dart around my practical, modestly decorated kitchen. I saw her gaze linger on the older model stainless steel appliances and the simple ceramic tile backsplash. I saw the subtle, condescending curl of her lip. She was comparing the home I had worked grueling overtime hours to afford against the sprawling $800,000 luxury estate she was currently purchasing with my stolen equity. "You always keep things so incredibly simple in here, Emily," Haley remarked, trailing her manicured fingernails along the edge of the granite island. "It is very practical, very you. But do you never just want to tear it all down and upgrade?" I was looking at these gorgeous imported marble countertops for the new house in Whispering Pines today. They are absolutely breathtaking. A kitchen should feel like a palace, do you not think? I poured 2 tall glasses of iced tea, handed one to her, and took my seat on the wooden bar stool directly above the hidden micro-recorder. "I suppose I have always been more focused on building savings than building palaces," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly mild and conversational. "But your new house sounds like a massive undertaking." Haley took a sip of her tea and let out a dramatic, theatrical sigh. "Oh, it is exhausting. Managing a luxury build, picking out custom nursery furniture for Liam, and running my business. It is a lot for a single mother to handle, but a house just does not feel like a true home without a baby running around in it." She paused, letting the silence hang heavily in the air between us, before tilting her head with a look of manufactured, pitying concern. "It really is such a profound shame that you and Brad never had children, Emily. I know you both work so incredibly hard. You spend all your time at that boring bank crunching numbers all day long. But what is the point of working yourself to the bone if you do not have a family to share it with? You just live this quiet, childless life. I worry about you. I worry that Brad must get so incredibly lonely in this big empty house while you are always focused on your spreadsheets." The audacity of her words was breathtaking. She was sitting in my kitchen, drinking my tea, wearing clothes bought with my husband's stolen money, and openly pitying me for not having the child that my husband had secretly fathered with her. A normal woman would have reached across the granite counter and slapped the smug expression right off her face. A hot-tempered woman would have screamed until her throat bled. But I was not a normal woman anymore. I was a predator executing a trap. I recognized the exact psychological game she was playing. Haley needed to feel superior. She needed to validate her own monstrous betrayal by convincing herself that I was a failure as a wife. She wanted to believe that she deserved Brad and the stolen wealth because she was the better, more desirable woman who had provided him with a son. I knew that if I fought back, if I showed anger or strength, she would put her guard up. But if I gave her exactly what she wanted, if I played the pathetic, broken, inadequate wife, her arrogance would make her incredibly careless. I lowered my gaze to my glass of iced tea. I allowed my shoulders to slump forward physically, shrinking my posture. I thought about the sheer, exhausting misery of the past 5 years. I thought about the weekends I had spent completely alone while Brad claimed to be working. I thought about the deep, hollow loneliness of my marriage. It was not difficult to summon the tears. I let them well up in my eyes, letting my lower lip tremble just enough to look entirely authentic. "It is really hard, Haley," I whispered, letting my voice crack with manufactured sorrow. I lifted a hand to wipe a fake tear from my cheek. I work so much because I just want to provide a solid foundation for us. But lately, I feel like Brad is a million miles away. He works late every single night. He's always stressed about money and commercial deals. I try to make his life easy. I try to manage the budget perfectly, but nothing I do ever seems to make him happy. I just feel so exhausted and so inadequate. I do not know how to fix my marriage. Haley practically glowed. I could actually see the rush of pure dopamine flood her system as she watched her older, responsible sister break down and confess absolute failure. She placed her glass on the counter and leaned forward, resting her elbows on the granite island. She was directly over the hidden microphone. "Oh, Emily," she cooed, her voice dripping with sickly sweet condescension. "You just do not understand how men operate. You treat your marriage like a business transaction. You think that if you pay the bills and keep a clean house, a man will be satisfied. But men do not want a roommate or an accountant. They want passion. They want softness. They want a woman who makes them feel powerful and worshipped." I sniffled, grabbing a paper napkin to dab at my eyes. "I just want him to feel secure. I try to save our money so he does not have to worry." Haley let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It was a cruel, mocking sound that echoed loudly in the quiet kitchen. "Money is just a tool, Emily. Men want a family. They want a legacy. A man only spoils a woman who can actually give him what he really wants. When you give a man a child, when you give him that perfect picture of a family, he will move heaven and earth to provide for you. He will empty his pockets to make sure you live like a queen." I looked up at her, keeping my eyes wide and entirely clueless. "It sounds like you have it all figured out, Haley, but I just do not understand how you are managing everything alone. You are buying an $800,000 house in the most expensive zip code in the county. Your online clothing boutique is lovely, but I know how the retail market is struggling right now. How are you possibly affording a luxury mortgage by yourself? Are you taking on massive amounts of debt?" Haley waved her hand dismissively, the heavy diamond bracelet on her wrist catching the kitchen light. Her ego was fully inflated now. She felt entirely untouchable. She was sitting in the throne of superiority I had built for her, and she could not resist the overwhelming urge to brag about her success. "I am not taking on any toxic bank debt, Emily. I am far too smart for that." Haley boasted, her voice ringing loud and clear. "My business is honestly just a fun hobby for me right now. I do not need to worry about retail profits because I have secured a highly dedicated, very private financial backer." "A financial backer?" I asked, letting my voice sound perfectly confused and slightly amazed. "You mean an investor for your clothing line?" Haley rolled her eyes, smiling a deeply wicked, entirely arrogant smile. "No, Emily. A personal investor. Someone who deeply believes in my future and wants to ensure Liam and I have the absolute best life possible. You do not get an estate in Whispering Pines by relying on a bank. You get it with leverage and private wealth." I leaned forward, mirroring her posture, ensuring my voice was captured clearly by the recorder. "That is incredible, Haley. But a down payment on an $800,000 house requires a massive amount of liquid cash. Are you saying this private investor simply handed you hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash to close on a house?" Haley leaned even closer. The scent of her floral perfume was physically nauseating, but I did not flinch. She wanted to prove her absolute dominance. She wanted to show me that she was living a life of elite privilege while I was struggling in suburban mediocrity. "Yes, Emily, that is exactly what I am saying." Haley confirmed, her voice ringing with absolute, undeniable pride. "My investor just transferred $400,000 in pure untraceable cash directly into my holding account this week. And there is another huge disbursement coming in a few days to cover all the luxury renovations and set up a private trust fund for Liam. It is a massive cash gift. No loans, no messy banking questions. Just pure, clean wealth handed directly to me because I know exactly how to make a man feel like a king. The words hung in the air. $400,000. The exact precise amount my parents had wired from their retirement accounts into Brad's holding company. She had just admitted clearly and proudly on tape to receiving the stolen funds. She had just confessed to the timeline, the amount, and the deliberate intent to use that money to purchase the estate in Whispering Pines. She had just casually admitted to participating in a massive coordinated financial fraud, wrapping it all up in a bow of breathtaking arrogance. I felt a cold, dark thrill wash over my entire body. I had her. The trap had snapped completely shut and she had gleefully walked right into the center of the cage. I let my jaw drop slightly, maintaining my facade of shocked, naive amazement. Wow, Haley, I do not even know what to say. That is an unimaginable amount of money. You must feel incredibly secure. I have never felt more secure in my entire life, Haley said, pulling back and sitting up straight. She checked her diamond watch, tapping the face with her manicured fingernail. Anyway, I really must be going. I have an appointment with a landscape architect to design the backyard for Liam. I just wanted to stop by and check on you. She stood up from this bar stool, smoothing the fabric of her expensive cashmere lounge set. I stood up with her, walking her toward the front foyer. I kept my posture small and defeated. Thank you for stopping by, Haley, I murmured, keeping my eyes downcast. And thank you for the advice. I really appreciate you taking the time. Haley stopped at the front door and pulled me into another hollow, patronizing embrace. She patted my back with genuine pity. Just try to soften up a little bit, Emily. Maybe if you stop focusing so much on your bank spreadsheets and start focusing on making Brad feel like a real man, your life would not be so miserable. I am praying for you. I smiled a tight, controlled expression that did not reach my eyes. Thank you, Haley. Have a wonderful time designing your new backyard. She opened the door, stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight, and walked down my driveway to her newly leased luxury SUV. I stood in the doorway watching her climb into the driver's seat and start the engine. I waited until her vehicle pulled out of the neighborhood and completely disappeared from view. I closed the front door. The heavy brass lock clicked into place, echoing loudly in the silent house. I did not move for a long moment. I simply stood in the foyer, letting the absolute silence wash over me. The pathetic, weeping, insecure wife routine instantly melted away from my posture. My shoulders rolled back, my spine straightened. The cold, calculating underwriter stepped entirely back into the light. I walked purposefully back into the kitchen. I reached under the lip of the heavy granite island and pulled the small black plastic micro recorder free from the tape. I held it in the palm of my hand, feeling the slight warmth of the battery. I pressed the playback button. The tiny speaker crackled to life. My investor just transferred $400,000 in pure untraceable cash directly into my holding account this week. And there is another huge disbursement coming in a few days to cover all the luxury renovations and set up a private trust fund for Liam. It is a massive cash gift. I pressed stop. The audio was pristine. Her voice was unmistakable. The admission of receiving the $400,000 was an absolute devastating piece of evidence. In the eyes of the law, she was no longer just an arrogant mistress bragging to her older sister. She was a documented co-conspirator in a federal wire fraud scheme. She had knowingly received illicitly transferred funds derived from the fraudulent liquidation of a retirement account. Mitchell Davis had told me that the federal authorities needed a clear, undeniable money trail to secure a conviction. Brad had initiated the fraudulent transfers, but Haley was the ultimate beneficiary. By admitting on tape that she had received the exact sum from a secret financial backer to buy the house in Whispering Pines, she had legally tied herself directly to the crime. She could no longer play the innocent, naive single mother who did not know where the money was coming from. She had bragged about the secrecy. She had gloated about the untraceable nature of the cash. I walked into my home office, plugged the digital recorder into my secure laptop terminal, and immediately uploaded the audio file. I created 3 separate encrypted backups of the recording. I labeled the primary file Exhibit C, the beneficiary confession. I attached the audio file to a secure direct email addressed to Mitchell Davis. I did not write a long emotional message. I simply typed a single sentence in the body of the email. The sister has officially confessed to receiving the primary disbursement on tape. I hit send. I leaned back in my office chair and stared at the dark computer monitor. Brad and Haley were entirely convinced they had won. They thought they had successfully drained my parents' life savings and secured a wealthy, unpunished future. They were celebrating their victory, completely unaware that a massive, inescapable federal cage was currently being lowered directly over their heads. The investigation phase was officially complete. The evidence was secured. The DNA results were locked in a vault, the forged loan documents were documented, and the financial confession was on tape. I stood up from my desk and walked to the window looking out over the quiet suburban street. The storm was coming, and I was going to be the one bringing the thunder. The digital clock in the bottom right corner of my monitor ticked to 9:15 in the morning. It was Friday. The regional bank branch around me hummed with the usual energetic cadence of the end of the work week. Tellers were greeting local business owners depositing their cash drawers. Loan officers were loudly discussing their weekend plans over the hiss of the espresso machine, and the fluorescent lights buzzed with a sterile, indifferent brightness. Under normal circumstances, I would have been completely absorbed in this rhythm, reviewing a stack of residential mortgage applications and sipping my usual vanilla latte. But today, the normal world felt entirely detached from my reality. I sat in my ergonomic mesh chair perfectly still, my hands resting flat on the cool laminate of my desk. My coffee had gone completely cold an hour ago. My eyes were fixed with a terrifying, unblinking intensity on the highly secured internal banking portal spread across my dual monitors. Today was not a normal Friday. Today was the execution. I had spent the entire week methodically weaving a flawless, invisible rope. Now I was simply waiting for my husband to put it around his own neck and kick away the chair. The application for the $600,000 home equity line of credit had sailed through the automated underwriting channels of the aggressive online lender Brad had selected. Because he had padded his income declarations and submitted a masterfully forged version of my signature, along with a fraudulent digital notary stamp, the file had encountered absolutely zero administrative friction. The online lender wanted the high interest yield, and they had rubber-stamped the final approval late Thursday afternoon. According to standard banking protocols, the massive sum of liquid cash was scheduled to be disbursed directly into his primary personal checking account this morning. I sat in the quiet of my cubicle, listening to the metronomic ticking of the wall clock behind my partition. 9:20, 9:25, 9:30. Every passing minute felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. A very small, irrational part of my brain, the ghost of the devoted wife who had spent 5 years sacrificing her youth to rebuild this man's life, desperately wanted him to stop. I wanted him to wake up, realize the monumental, unforgivable evil of what he was doing to me and my elderly parents, and cancel the transaction. I wanted him to be a decent human being. But the seasoned financial underwriter, the woman who had traced the stolen retirement funds and listened to his mistress brag on a hidden microphone, knew exactly who Brad Evans was. He was a predator entirely consumed by his own arrogance. He was not going to stop. At exactly 9:41 in the morning, the screen on my left monitor automatically refreshed. A bright green notification flashed across the top of the internal ledger software. I clicked the alert, my pulse hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against my ribs. The transaction history for Brad's personal checking account populated the screen. There, sitting right at the very top of the daily queue, was a massive incoming automated clearinghouse transfer. The source was the online mortgage lender. The amount was exactly $600,000. I watched the status indicator shift from pending to posted. The funds officially cleared. The massive sum of money successfully dropped into his account, instantly inflating his available balance to a number he had never legitimately earned in his entire life. A sickening wave of nausea rolled through my stomach, leaving a cold metallic taste in the back of my mouth. That money was not just a random collection of digital zeros and ones. That money represented the physical walls and the solid roof of my home. It represented the sanctuary I had fought tirelessly to secure after he had completely bankrupted his first business. He had just successfully drained the pristine equity of my property entirely behind my back, using my forged identity to leverage the transaction. My house was now encumbered by a massive toxic debt that I could never hope to pay off alone. He had literally stolen my shelter to buy a mansion for my younger sister. I gripped the edge of my desk, forcing myself to breathe slowly and evenly. I could not afford to let panic cloud my judgment. Mitchell Davis, the ruthless corporate litigator I had secretly hired, had explicitly warned me about this exact moment. He had sat across from me behind his sprawling mahogany desk and told me that the theft of the home equity was merely a civil dispute in the eyes of local law enforcement. If I sounded the alarm right now, Brad would simply hire a slimy defense attorney, claim the forgery was a misunderstanding or a desperate marital mistake, and tie me up in domestic litigation for years. I needed something far more devastating. I needed a crime that carried mandatory minimum sentences. I needed federal jurisdiction. I did not touch my desk phone. I did not log out of the system. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the screen. Mitchell had assured me that Brad's towering hubris would be his ultimate undoing. Brad believed he was an untouchable genius. He had successfully stolen $400,000 from my parents' retirement funds, and now he had extracted $600,000 from my home equity. He had $1 million in liquid cash, burning a massive hole in his digital pocket. A man like Brad, a man driven by ego and the desperate need to impress his demanding mistress, would not let that money sit idle. He needed to finalize the purchase of the luxury estate in Whispering Pines before the weekend. He needed to prove to Haley that he was the wealthy, powerful king she demanded. I watched the screen waiting for the final fatal maneuver. The agonizing silence stretched on. 9:50, 9:55. I pictured Brad sitting in his plush real estate office across town. I pictured him staring at his own computer screen, grinning at his newly inflated bank balance. I knew he was likely texting Haley, bragging about his financial prowess, promising her the keys to her custom-built palace. He probably thought I was sitting at my desk, blindly processing mortgage loans for strangers, completely oblivious to the fact that my own financial throat had just been slit. At exactly 10 o'clock, the digital ledger on my monitor flickered. A new line item appeared directly beneath the massive deposit. It was an outgoing wire transfer initiation request. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the granular details of the transfer protocol. The requested withdrawal amount was $600,000. The destination account belonged to the Whispering Pines Escrow and Title Management Corporation. I immediately checked the routing transit number of the receiving institution. This was the exact detail Mitchell Davis and I had been praying for. The escrow company did not use a local community bank. They utilized a massive national corporate holding bank whose primary clearinghouse was located across the border in a neighboring state. The moment Brad authorized this specific transfer, he was not just moving stolen money across town. He was transmitting illicitly obtained funds across state lines, utilizing a federally insured banking network. I stared at the pending status indicator. My hand hovered over the computer mouse, shaking slightly with the sheer terrifying gravity of the moment. Brad was standing right on the precipice of absolute destruction. All he had to do was click confirm. Come on, I whispered into the empty space of my cubicle, my voice trembling with a mixture of raw devastation and pure unadulterated vengeance. Do it. Be the monster you are. The status indicator on the screen suddenly changed from pending authorization to processing. 3 seconds later, the text turned solid black. The status updated to completed. The wire transfer was officially executed. The $600,000 vanished from his checking account, hurtling through the digital ether across state lines toward the title company. The trap slammed completely and irrevocably shut. The crime was no longer a messy local forgery. It was no longer a complicated family dispute over retirement funds and property lines. The exact second that money crossed the state border, Brad Evans officially committed federal wire fraud. He had utilized interstate telecommunications facilities to execute a fraudulent financial scheme. He had combined it with aggravated identity theft bank fraud and the malicious exploitation of my elderly parents' pension accounts. He had crossed a threshold from which there was absolutely no return. The local police department no longer mattered. The Federal Bureau of Investigation now held absolute jurisdiction over his life. A profound, chilling silence washed over my entire body. The lingering grief, the haunting memories of our wedding day, the desperate hopes I had once held for our future together, they all completely evaporated, leaving behind a sterile, immaculate void. I had survived his betrayal. I had survived my sister's breathtaking cruelty. I had outplayed them both. I moved with rapid clinical precision. I highlighted the completed wire transfer log, capturing the timestamps, the routing numbers, and the digital authorization signatures. I hid the print command on my keyboard. The heavy laser printer on the credenza next to my desk immediately whirred to life, churning out thick, crisp pages of undeniable, federally admissible evidence. I gathered the warm sheets of paper, verifying every single detail was perfectly legible. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out my heavy leather briefcase. I placed the freshly printed wire transfer logs inside a red manila folder. They joined the staggering mountain of evidence I had already compiled. The folder contained the original screenshots of the forged home equity application with the fake notary stamp. It contained the terrifyingly clear audio file of Haley arrogantly confessing to receiving the stolen $400,000 from her secret investor on the hidden kitchen microphone. It contained the certified laboratory documents confirming with absolute biological certainty that Brad was the father of Haley's child. And it contained the legally invalid, specifically altered affidavit signature that Mitchell and I had pre-registered to prove the entire loan was executed under fraudulent pretenses. I zipped the briefcase shut. The leather felt incredibly heavy, anchored by the weight of a ruined family and the promise of absolute justice. I picked up my cell phone from the desk and dialed Mitchell Davis's direct private line. He answered on the second ring, his deep, gravelly voice entirely devoid of pleasantries. "Is it done?" Mitchell asked simply. I stared at the empty computer monitor. "Yes," I replied, my voice sounding completely unrecognizable to my own ears. It was smooth cold and entirely devoid of emotion. He just initiated the wire transfer. $600,000 sent directly to the out-of-state holding bank for the Whispering Pines title company. The transaction has officially cleared the clearinghouse. I heard the soft scratching of a premium fountain pen on paper through the receiver. "Excellent work," Emily Mitchell said, a distinct note of dangerous satisfaction echoing in his tone. "You played this absolutely perfectly. Your financial exposure is completely insulated within the blind trust, and the invalid signature protects you from any civil liability regarding the property lien. We have everything we need." "What happens now?" I asked, my grip tightening around the handle of my briefcase. "Now we drop the hammer," Mitchell replied smoothly. "I want you to immediately upload the encrypted digital copies of those wire transfer logs to the secure server I provided you. Do not wait until you get home. Do it right this second. I am uploading them now," I said, clicking the encrypted folder and dragging it into the secure portal. The progress bar shot across the screen, confirming the successful transfer of the files. "They are in your system." Mitchell let out a short, sharp breath. "I have them. I am currently packaging the entire dossier. The forged documents, the wire fraud logs, the elder abuse financial tracing, and the audio confession from your sister. I am bypassing the local authorities entirely. I am sending this directly to the lead prosecutor at the United States Attorney's Office and my primary contact at the FBI White-Collar Crimes Division." "How long will it take?" I asked, feeling a sudden surge of adrenaline rush through my veins. "With this level of meticulously documented, unassailable evidence of active ongoing federal wire fraud and the interstate transfer of illicit funds, they will not wait," Mitchell assured me, his voice radiating absolute confidence. "Federal judges do not look kindly on individuals stealing retirement funds from the elderly to buy luxury real estate. The warrants for their arrest and the immediate seizure of all their assets will be drafted and signed before the banks even close today." I closed my eyes, picturing Brad sitting in his office completely oblivious to the massive federal machinery that was currently locking onto his coordinates. I pictured Haley touring her new luxury estate, entirely unaware that the walls were about to collapse around her. "Where should I be when it happens?" I asked quietly. Mitchell paused for a moment. "Go home, Emily. Go home, lock your doors, and do not answer your phone for anyone except me. When the FBI hits his office, he is going to panic. When they freeze the title company escrow account, your sister is going to lose her mind. You need to be completely isolated from the fallout. The trap is completely shut. We have won." I thanked him and ended the call. I stood up from my desk, picked up my heavy leather briefcase, and walked away from my cubicle. I walked past the break room, past the bustling teller stations, and out the heavy glass doors of the bank. The bright morning sun hit my face, but the air felt crisp and entirely clean. As I drove away from the bank, heading toward the quiet sanctuary of my home, A profound sense of absolute finality settled over my entire being. The meticulously constructed lies, the secret betrayals, and the devastating financial theft were permanently over. The house of cards was falling, and I was going to sit quietly in the wreckage and watch them face the absolute devastation they had brought upon themselves. Saturday evening arrived, draped in the crisp, unseasonably cool air of a North Carolina autumn. The annual charity gala hosted by our church was the undisputed crown jewel of the local suburban social calendar. The large fellowship hall, usually a humble space for youth group meetings and Sunday school activities, had been completely transformed into a breathtaking venue. Heavy velvet drapes covered the tall windows, and intricate arrangements of white lilies and hydrangeas sat at the center of dozens of perfectly round dining tables. Soft golden light radiated from the rented crystal chandeliers, suspended from the vaulted ceiling. Hundreds of local business leaders, respected city council members, wealthy real estate developers, and devoted church elders were gathered in the room. The air was thick with the scent of expensive catered food, dry clean suits, and the quiet, steady hum of affluent community members mingling over sparkling cider. My parents, Thomas and Susan, were the designated hosts for the evening. They had poured their entire hearts and souls into organizing the event. They stood near the grand entrance, beaming with immense pride, greeting every single guest with warm handshakes and gracious smiles. They were entirely blissfully unaware that their own financial foundation had been completely gutted by the man who was about to take the center stage. Haley sat in the highly coveted front row, a picture of manufactured grace and saintly devotion. She wore a demure, high-necked navy blue dress that screamed conservative elegance. She was bouncing little Liam on her knee, softly kissing his blonde head, while the wives of the church elders fawned over her. They whispered about her incredible selflessness, praising the beautiful young single mother who had sacrificed her youth to rescue a European orphan. Haley played the role to absolute perfection, offering shy, humble smiles and thanking the congregation for their continuous prayers and support. I stood completely hidden in the shadows at the very back of the fellowship hall. I had deliberately volunteered to manage the audio and visual equipment for the evening. The sound booth was a raised enclosed platform that provided a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire room. I stood behind the large mixing console, resting my hands lightly on the keyboard of the master presentation laptop. The heavy commercial projector hummed loudly above my head, casting a bright blank square of white light onto the massive screen hanging directly behind the main podium. Brad had spent the last 3 weeks meticulously laying the groundwork for tonight. He had used his overwhelming silver-tongued charm to convince the senior pastor that the charity gala needed a keynote address focusing on the intersection of faith and modern economics. Brad had titled his presentation Family Values and Financial Integrity. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the title alone was enough to make my blood run entirely cold. He was not giving a speech to inspire the congregation. He was using this deeply religious, highly trusting platform as a hunting ground. He planned to use his allotted 20 minutes on stage to officially pitch his non-existent commercial real estate fund to the wealthiest members of our community. He wanted to secure more victims, gather more fraudulent capital, and expand his financial empire before fleeing the state with my sister. The low chatter in the room slowly faded into a respectful hush as the senior pastor stepped up to the wooden podium. He tapped the microphone, the sound echoing crisply through the state-of-the-art speakers I was currently controlling. The pastor spoke passionately about the importance of community charity and the sacred duty of protecting our families. He then turned his attention to the front row, offering a wide, appreciative smile. Tonight, we have a very special presentation from a man who truly embodies the spirit of our congregation. The pastor announced, his voice ringing with absolute sincerity. He is a devoted husband, a pillar of our local business community, and a man who understands that true wealth is found in integrity and moral clarity. Please welcome Mr. Brad Evans. The fellowship hall erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. Brad stood up from his seat next to my parents. He adjusted the lapels of his custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo. He looked incredibly handsome, radiating a polished, undeniable magnetism. He patted my father firmly on the shoulder, offered a respectful nod to the pastor, and confidently climbed the short, wooden steps to the stage. He took the microphone from the stand, flashing his signature, blindingly white smile at the crowd. Thank you, Pastor Brad, began his voice smooth, rich, and perfectly modulated to convey deep humility. And thank you to everyone here tonight. Looking out at this room, I am reminded of how incredibly blessed we are to be surrounded by people who value truth, honesty, and the sacred bond of family. We live in a world that constantly tries to tear those values down. We live in a world of shortcuts and deceptions. But tonight, I want to talk to you about building a legacy that is entirely bulletproof. A legacy built on absolute transparency. He paused, letting the heavy, profound irony of his words settle over the hundreds of listening ears. He raised his hand and gestured elegantly toward the back of the hall where I was standing in the shadows. None of my success would be possible without the unwavering support of my beautiful wife and Emily. Brad continued, his voice dropping to a softer, deeply affectionate register. She is the rock of our household. She keeps me grounded, and she reminds me every single day what it means to be truly loyal. A collective warm murmur of approval rippled through the seated crowd. Several people turned in their chairs to look back at the sound booth, offering me supportive, admiring smiles. I kept my face entirely blank, my eyes fixed firmly on the glowing screen of the presentation laptop. The level of his arrogance was practically a living, breathing entity in the room. He truly believed he was invincible. He believed he could stand in the house of his faith, look his wife in the eye, and publicly praise her loyalty while actively draining her bank accounts and sleeping with her younger sister. Brad turned his attention back to the crowd, gripping the edges of the wooden podium. When we talk about financial integrity, we are really talking about securing the future for the next generation, he said, his tone shifting into his practiced authoritative business pitch. We are talking about making choices that protect our loved ones. I want to show you exactly what I mean. I want to share a visual representation of the future we should all be striving to build. Brad looked toward the back of the hall and gave me a sharp, confident nod. Emily, if you would please bring up the first slide. I looked down at the keyboard. My hands were completely steady. My pulse was a slow, deliberate drumbeat in my ears. I reached out with my right index finger and firmly pressed the spacebar. The projector above my head whirred, shifting its internal lenses. The massive 20-foot screen behind Brad did not illuminate with a corporate logo or a graph showing projected real estate yields. The screen lit up with the brilliant high-definition photograph from the Magnolia Inn. The image was absolutely colossal. Every single colorful, damning detail was magnified for the entire room to witness. There was Brad, shirtless and glowing in the afternoon sun, wearing designer swim trunks. There was the chubby, blonde-haired, one-year-old boy held securely and lovingly in his arms. And there was Haley standing intimately against his bare chest, wearing a tiny red bikini, her head thrown back in joyous, carefree laughter. It was the undeniable, perfect portrait of a secret, wealthy, and incredibly happy family. The fellowship hall went completely horrifyingly silent. It was not a gradual quieting down. It was an instant, suffocating vacuum of sound. The clinking of crystal glasses ceased entirely. The shuffling of chairs stopped. 200 highly respected community members, church elders, and business executives sat completely paralyzed, their eyes wide and locked onto the massive projection of their keynote speaker, practically naked with his sister-in-law. Brad stood at the podium, completely oblivious to the image radiating behind him. He maintained his charismatic smile for exactly 4 seconds, waiting for the crowd to react to what he assumed was a slide outlining his commercial real estate portfolio. When the silence stretched into a bizarre heavy void, his smile began to falter. He noticed the mayor staring at the screen with his jaw completely dropped. He saw the senior pastor taking a slow, trembling step backward. Brad slowly turned his head to look over his shoulder. I watched the exact moment his reality completely fractured. His broad shoulders stiffened violently. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords entirely failed to produce a single sound. He stared at the massive projection of his own secret life, completely stripped of his silver-tongued defenses. Before he could recover his breath, before he could formulate a single lie or attempt to explain away the photograph, I pressed the spacebar a second time. The image of the luxury resort vanished instantly, replaced by a stark black and white document. The header of the page clearly displayed the logo of the highly accredited forensic testing laboratory. The text was magnified so large that even the elderly congregants in the very back row could read it perfectly. I had highlighted the final conclusion in bright glowing yellow. The forensic analysis indicates that the alleged father cannot be excluded as the biological father of the child. Probability of paternity is 99.99%. A low collective gasp rolled through the fellowship hall. It sounded like the ocean pulling back before a massive tidal wave. The context was no longer ambiguous. The photograph could no longer be dismissed as a strange, inappropriate vacation coincidence. The cold, hard science projected on the wall proved with absolute, unassailable certainty that Brad Evans had fathered a child with Haley. The saintly, charitable story of the adopted European orphan completely disintegrated into dust right in front of my parents' eyes. I did not stop. I did not give anyone in the room time to process the marital scandal. I needed to ensure the complete and total destruction of his professional and legal existence. I pressed the spacebar for the third time. The screen shifted to a complex, highly detailed financial ledger. The left side of the projection displayed the final authorization form for the home equity line of credit. My forged signature was magnified, sitting right next to the illegal digital notary stamp. The right side of the projection displayed the official bank wire transfer logs. I had used bright red digital arrows to trace the exact movement of the funds. The arrows clearly showed $400,000 moving directly out of the retirement accounts owned by Thomas and Susan. The red arrows traced the money into Brad's holding company and then directly into the escrow account belonging to Haley for the purchase of the luxury estate in Whispering Pines. The room shifted instantly from experiencing a shocking domestic scandal to witnessing the live documentation of a massive predatory federal crime. The wealthy real estate developers, the bank executives, and the business owners in the audience recognized the wire transfer codes immediately. They knew exactly what a fraudulent HELOC application looked like. They saw the undeniable paper trail of elder financial abuse projected in high definition. Brad was not just an adulterer. He was a thief who had systematically preyed upon the very people sitting in the front row. The paralyzed silence finally shattered, breaking apart into an absolute deafening uproar. The senior pastor dropped his microphone. The heavy electronic device hit the wooden floor of the stage with a loud, violent crack, sending a high-pitched, agonizing shriek of feedback through the towering speakers. People began to shout. Chairs scraped harshly against the floor as several of the church elders stood up in utter disbelief. The business executives began muttering furiously to one another, pointing at the financial documents on the screen, their faces twisted in absolute disgust. I looked down at the front row. My mother, Susan, was clutching the edge of the dining table, her face entirely devoid of blood. She looked like she was struggling to draw oxygen into her lungs. My father, Thomas, was standing up, his large, calloused hands shaking violently. He turned away from the stage and looked directly at his youngest daughter. Haley was visibly shrinking in her chair. The saintly, confident posture she had maintained all evening had completely collapsed. She pulled little Liam tightly against her chest, attempting to hide behind the child. Her face was chalk white, her eyes wide with absolute primal panic. She looked at our parents, her mouth opening and closing like a trapped fish, but there were no lies left for her to tell. The truth was burning brightly on the wall for the entire city to see. On the stage, the charismatic, polished gentleman completely vanished. The sophisticated business facade melted away, revealing the terrified, cornered criminal underneath. Brad spun back around to face the audience, his chest heaving. He looked at the furious faces of his potential investors, the disgusted glares of his community, and the shattered expressions of his in-laws. He realized in that exact moment that his business, his reputation, his freedom, and his entire future had just been completely obliterated. His eyes frantically scanned the room, flying over the chaotic crowd until they locked onto the sound booth at the very back of the hall. He found me standing in the shadows, my hands resting calmly on the presentation laptop. "Cut the power!" Brad screamed, his voice entirely raw and unhinged, easily cutting through the noise of the crowd. "Cut the damn screen off right now!" I did not move. I did not break eye contact. I stood perfectly still, offering him the exact same cold, calculated smile he had given me when he handed me the fraudulent tax documents. Brad completely snapped. He abandoned the wooden podium, practically leaping off the side of the raised stage. He hit the carpeted floor running. He shoved past a bewildered church elder, knocking a crystal water glass off a table, sending it shattering into a dozen pieces. His tailored tuxedo jacket flew open as he charged furiously down the long center aisle of the fellowship hall. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, desperate rage, his eyes burning with sheer panic as he sprinted directly toward the sound booth, completely unmasked and entirely destroyed. The heavy thud of Brad sprinting down the carpeted aisle echoed through the fellowship hall. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. He was closing the distance to the sound booth, screaming my name. His hands balled into tight fists. I stood my ground, my hands resting calmly on the edge of the mixing console, watching the man I had once loved completely unravel. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply waited. Before Brad could cross the final 20 feet, the massive oak double doors at the very back of the banquet hall exploded open. The sound was like a cannon firing inside the cavernous quiet space. A team of federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers with bold yellow letters spelling FBI across their backs poured into the room. They moved with terrifying absolute precision, completely ignoring the horrified gasps of the church congregation. Two large agents intercepted Brad mid-stride. They grabbed him by the shoulders of his expensive custom tuxedo, spun him around violently, and slammed him face first onto the nearest catered dining table. A towering centerpiece of white hydrangeas and tall crystal vases shattered instantly, sending a spray of cold water and broken glass crashing onto the polished hardwood floor. Brad let out a muffled grunt of pain as his cheek was pressed hard against the damp tablecloth. "Brad Evans, you are under arrest," a senior agent barked, his deep voice carrying clearly over the shocked murmurs of the wealthy business leaders and church elders. "You are being charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and financial embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent." The sharp, definitive click of heavy metal handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed through the hall like a judge striking a gavel. The local real estate tycoon, the charismatic keynote speaker who had just been preaching about financial integrity, was now bleeding slightly from a scratch on his cheek, pinned beneath the weight of federal law enforcement. He twisted his head, looking up at me from the table, his eyes wide with a pathetic, desperate terror. The silver-tongued salesman had absolutely nothing left to say. The room was in a state of total pandemonium. Women were clutching their pearls, men were pulling out their cell phones, and the senior pastor was standing on the stage with his hands covering his mouth. Out of the chaotic crowd, a figure in a navy blue dress broke away and charged frantically toward the sound booth. It was Haley. She had abandoned her child with my completely paralyzed mother and was running toward me like a wild animal. Her pristine, saintly facade was entirely destroyed. Her blonde hair was a tangled mess, and her face was streaked with dark mascara tears. "You ruined my life!" Haley screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical, as she slammed her hands against the low wall of the sound booth. "You destroyed everything. How could you do this to your own sister? How could you do this to my family?" I looked down at her, feeling a profound, expansive emptiness. The anger I had carried for weeks was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, impenetrable calm. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell back. I simply reached into my heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a crisp white legal document that Mitchell Davis had prepared specifically for this exact moment. I leaned over the booth and pressed the document flat against Haley's chest until she instinctively reached up to grab it. "I did not ruin your life, Haley," I said, my voice completely steady and even. "You ruined it the moment you decided to steal from the people who raised you." She stared down at the paper, her hands trembling so violently the document shook. She could not comprehend the complex legal jargon printed on the page, but she understood the bold red seal at the top. I looked her directly in the eyes, ensuring she heard every single word I was about to say over the noise of the federal agents hauling Brad away. "Your escrow account at the title company is completely frozen by federal order," I told her, delivering the final crushing blow. "The luxury house in Whispering Pines has been officially seized by the government. Your online clothing boutique has been listed as collateral in the civil recovery suit I filed this morning. You are entirely bankrupt, Haley, and the man you conspired with your brilliant secret investor is going to federal prison." Haley opened her mouth, but only a dry, choking sob came out. Her knees buckled beneath her. She sank slowly to the floor of the fellowship hall, clutching the legal notice to her chest, wailing loudly as the reality of her total devastation finally set in. I turned away from her, powered down the presentation laptop, and walked out the side door of the church, leaving the chaos, the betrayal, and the toxic remnants of my past permanently behind me. 6 months passed, bringing a quiet, beautiful spring to the city of Charlotte. The changing seasons mirrored the complete transformation of my life. The justice system had moved with brutal efficiency. Brad had attempted to secure a plea deal, offering to testify against his associates. But Mitchell Davis had built a cage so perfectly airtight that the federal prosecutors did not need his cooperation. Brad Evans was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. The man who had obsessed over tailored suits and expensive steak dinners was now wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, stripped of his luxury watches and his arrogant pride. He would spend the next decade staring at a concrete wall with absolutely nothing but the memory of his own catastrophic greed to keep him company. Mitchell Davis proved to be worth every single penny of his exorbitant legal fees. He was a master of financial warfare. Using the pre-registered altered signature and the undeniable evidence of identity theft, Mitchell systematically dismantled the fraudulent home equity line of credit. He forced the online lender to completely reverse the toxic lien against my property, proving they had failed to perform basic due diligence. My home was officially mine again, entirely free and clear of Brad's manufactured debt. Even more importantly, Mitchell's aggressive asset recovery strategy succeeded in tracing and seizing the stolen retirement funds. Every single cent of the $400,000 was successfully clawed back from the frozen escrow account and safely returned to my parents' pension funds. My parents, Thomas and Susan, were utterly broken by the revelation of what their youngest daughter had done. The betrayal aged them significantly, but the return of their life savings provided a small measure of comfort. They realized how dangerously close they had come to spending their twilight years in total poverty. They finally saw Haley for exactly who she was. They legally cut all ties, refusing to answer her calls or provide her with any financial assistance. Haley was completely ostracized from our church community and the wealthy social circles she had desperately tried to infiltrate. Stripped of her fraudulent boutique and her stolen down payment, she was forced to face the harsh and unforgiving reality of her actions. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was currently renting a tiny rundown apartment on the outskirts of the city, working a grueling minimum wage retail job just to afford basic groceries and childcare for Liam. Her dreams of living like a queen in a vaulted ceiling mansion had evaporated, replaced by the exhausting, miserable struggle she truly deserved. I, on the other hand, had entirely rebuilt my world. I sold the suburban house I had shared with Brad. I wanted absolutely no lingering ghosts of my failed marriage haunting my space. I took the clean equity from the sale, combined it with my heavily protected blind trust savings, and purchased a beautiful historic home in a quiet tree-lined neighborhood. I bought it entirely on my own, relying on nobody but myself. I was promoted to a senior managerial role at the regional bank recognized by the corporate board for my sharp analytical skills and my unwavering dedication to financial integrity. It is a Saturday evening. I am sitting on the wide wrap-around wooden porch of my new home. The air is warm and fragrant, carrying the sweet scent of blooming jasmine from the garden I planted myself. I am resting in a comfortable wicker rocking chair, holding a tall glass of cold iced tea, listening to the gentle clinking of the ice cubes. I am looking out at a peaceful, spectacular sunset painting the sky in deep shades of purple and gold. There is no anxiety gnawing at my chest. There are no secrets hiding in the shadows. There is only a profound, unbreakable sense of peace. A woman's loyalty is an incredible gift, but you must never let it become a blindfold. We are taught to trust our partners, to support their dreams, and to build a life based on mutual faith. But blind trust is a dangerous vulnerability. Always know exactly where your money is. Always maintain your own financial independence. Protect your assets with the same fierce dedication you use to protect your heart, and never under any circumstances sign a piece of paper that you have not read twice. If my story reminded you of the absolute importance of staying vigilant and legally protected, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below letting me know what time it is right now and what state you are watching from. Stay strong, protect yourselves, and I will see you in the next story.